Abigail Harper dropped to her knees in the mud of the ranch yard, wrapped her arms around a starving child nobody else would touch, and pressed her last piece of bread into his shaking hands, while 30 grown men stood laughing at the size of her body. "Eat honey," she whispered. "Ain't nobody gonna laugh at you while I'm here." The laughter died, because a fat widow with nothing left in the world had just shamed every man on the largest cattle ranch in Montana. If you're watching this, stay with me to the very end, and comment the name of the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The boy couldn't have been more than 7. He'd come stumbling up the road behind Abigail's wagon an hour earlier, ribs showing through a shirt 3 sizes too big, and not a single one of the men leaning against the corral fence had moved to help him. They'd been too busy watching her. "Look at the size of that one," a lean cowboy named Dutch had said loud enough to carry. "Reckon she ate the last 3 cooks who came through here." The men had howled at that. Abigail had heard it all her life. She'd learned a long time ago that a laugh could not break a bone, and a cruel word could not empty a stomach any emptier than grief already had. So she'd climbed down from her wagon slow and careful, her worn boots sinking in the mud, and she'd walked past every one of them without a word. Then she'd seen the boy, and now she was on her knees in front of all of them, and not one man was laughing anymore. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked the child. "Toby," he whispered. "Ma'am, I ain't ate since—" "I know, baby, I know. Slow now, small bites." She smoothed the hair back from his forehead with a hand that had buried a husband and dug his grave alone. "There's more where that came from. I promise you that." A shadow fell across the two of them. The man who cast it stood a full head taller than any of his hands, broad through the shoulders, with a face weathered into hard lines by 10 Montana winters. He wore no smile. He'd worn no smile in 3 years, and the whole valley knew it. "You're on Hayes land," he said. Abigail didn't look up right away. She finished tucking the last crumb into Toby's palm, closed the boy's fingers around it, and only then did she rise, one hand braced on her own knee to push herself standing. "Then I reckon you'd be Jacob Hayes," she said. "I would." "Abigail Harper." She wiped her muddy hand on her apron and did not extend it because she'd learned that men like this did not shake the hand of a woman like her. "I came about work." Jacob Hayes looked at her the way every man had looked at her since she was 15 years old. His eyes went to her body first. Not her face, not her eyes, her body. And Abigail stood there and let him look because she had long since stopped hoping to be seen any other way. "Ain't got work for a woman," Jacob said. "You got work for a cook. I saw the plate one of your men threw in the yard on my way up the road. Beans burnt black on one side, raw on the other. Coffee thick enough to shoe a horse. You got 20-30 men breaking their backs from dark to dark, and you're feeding them slop." She let that sit. A man works harder when his belly's full and happy. You know that. You just ain't had nobody who could give it to him. Behind Jacob, Dutch snorted. "Boss, she thinks she's here to answer the bride ad. Somebody in Silver Creek's been running a mail order notice. That's what she—" "I'm not a bride," Abigail said quietly. "I'm just a cook." She'd meant it plain. She'd meant it the way a person states a fact about the weather. But the words landed in that yard like a stone in a still pond, and the ripples of laughter started small and grew until every man was doubled over with it. A bride. Her. The fat widow in the muddy apron thinking any man in the territory would take her to a church. Abigail's face burned. Not from shame at the words. From shame that she'd said something true and honest, and they'd turned it into a joke. That was the part that never stopped hurting no matter how old she got. She did not cry. She had promised herself years ago, standing over a fresh grave with frozen tears on her cheeks, that she would never again cry in front of people who wanted to see her do it. Instead, she turned to Jacob Hayes and she raised her chin. "Give me one meal," she said. "One supper. Tonight. If your men don't tell you it's the best they've ate all year, I'll be off your land before the sun goes down and you'll never see my face again. You won't owe me a cent. You won't owe me a thank you." She glanced at the laughing men, then back at him. That seems more than fair for a woman who came here for nothing but honest work and got laughed at instead." The laughter petered out. Jacob Hayes studied her a long moment. There was something working behind those hard gray eyes, though a stranger couldn't have said what. He was thinking she'd fail. Abigail knew that look too. He'd let her cook watch her burn it same as his own men did, and send her packing with the satisfaction of having been right. It cost him nothing to be generous when he was certain of the outcome. "Dutch," he said. "Show her the kitchen." "Boss, show her the kitchen." Jacob turned and walked off toward the barn without another word, his boots throwing up small clots of mud. Dutch spat to the side and jerked his head. "This way then. Don't touch nothing you don't need to." Abigail bent and took Toby's hand. "Boy comes with me." "Boy ain't none of your—" "Boy comes with me," she said again, and something in the flatness of it made Dutch shrug and let it go. The ranch kitchen was worse than she'd feared. Flour gone to weevils in an open barrel. A slab of salt pork left uncovered and gray. Pots crusted with the burnt remains of a dozen ruined meals. 2 windows so caked with grease that the afternoon light came through the color of dishwater. No woman had set foot in here in years, and it showed in every filthy corner. Abigail stood in the doorway and took it all in, and for the first time since she'd rolled onto Hazeland, she smiled. "Well," she said softly to no one but herself, "ain't nothing here that hard work won't fix, and hard work I got plenty of." She set Toby on a stool with a heel of bread and a cup of watered milk she found in the cool cellar, and then she rolled her sleeves to the elbow and went to war. She hauled the weevil flour out to the yard herself, a barrel most men would have fetched help for, and dumped it for the chickens. She scrubbed the grease from the windows with sand and vinegar until the light came clean. She scoured every pot down to bare iron. She built the fire up proper and steady the way her mother had taught her, low and patient, no rushing it. The men drifted past the open door as they worked one at a time, pretending they weren't looking. She let them look. She'd been looked at her whole life. Let them see a woman who knew what she was doing for once. From the cellar and the smokehouse, she pulled together what the ranch had and didn't know it had. A haunch of beef going tough that she'd braise slow and tender. Potatoes she'd never let boil to mush. Onions, a little dried sage, the good drippings she rendered fresh instead of the rancid grease they'd been cooking in. She made biscuits with a cold hand and a light touch, the secret her mother swore. By worked fast, so the heat of your fingers never toughened the dough. And she made pie. 2 dried apple pies from fruit she found forgotten in a sack with a crust. She rolled thin as a whisper, and a sugar glaze that caught the firelight gold. By the time the sun hung low and orange over the western ridges, the whole yard smelled like something none of those men had smelled since they were boys in their mothers' kitchens. They came in slow, suspicious, sat down at the long table with their hats still on elbows, guarding their plates like they expected a trick. Abigail served them herself. She didn't say a word. She just set the food down in front of each man, 1 plate at a time, and stepped back to the wall to watch. Dutch was the first to take a bite. He'd meant to make a show of not liking it, she could see that plain. He got the fork halfway to his mouth with a smirk already forming. The smirk died. He chewed. He stopped. He looked down at the plate like it had spoken to him. Then he took another bite faster and another, and he did not look up again. One by one, down the length of that table, the same thing happened. The joking stopped. The guarded elbows relaxed. Grown men who hadn't been fed like this in years bent over their plates and ate like it was the first real meal of their lives, because in a way it was. Nobody spoke. The only sound in that room was forks against tin, and the small involuntary noises men make when food reaches something in them deeper than hunger. Jacob Hayes stood in the doorway and watched his ranch fall silent over a fat widow's supper. Abigail didn't gloat. She moved down the table, refilling coffee and cutting pie quiet as a shadow, and when she reached Toby at the end, she gave the boy the biggest slice of all and touched his hair, and the boy looked up at her like she'd hung the moon. That was when a hand named Cole, the youngest of them, barely 18, set down his fork and said the words no one else had the nerve to say out loud. "Ma'am." His voice cracked on it. This is the best food I ever ate in my whole life. My ma couldn't cook like this. Agreement low and rough and a little ashamed of itself. He's right, said an older hand called Pete, a man with gray in his beard who'd said nothing cruel in the yard but nothing kind either. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve and looked straight at her for the first time. Best I've had in 10 years, ma'am. Maybe ever. I'm sorry for what got said out there. That was low of us. Abigail stood very still against the wall. She had come to this ranch expecting nothing. She had learned to expect nothing because nothing could not disappoint her, and hope was a luxury she'd buried alongside her husband. She had steeled herself for another laugh, another door, another muddy road out of another town that didn't want her. She had not steeled herself for kindness, and so it was kindness, not cruelty, that finally put the sting behind her eyes. She blinked it back hard because she'd made a promise, and Abigail Harper kept her promises. "Thank you," she managed. "That's real kind of you to say." Jacob Hayes crossed the room. The men went quiet again, watching their boss come, not knowing which way it would fall. He stopped in front of Abigail. He was close enough now that she had to tip her head back to meet his eyes, and this time she noticed this. One time his eyes did not go to her body first. They went to her face. "Cole's right," Jacob said. Low, rough, like the words cost him something. "That's the best supper's ever come off this ranch. My mother's kitchen included, God rest her." He paused. "I said some things in that yard I let my men say. That was wrong of me. A man ought to judge a worker by their work." "Yes," Abigail said quietly. "He ought. Job's yours, if you want it. Cook's wages, cook's room off the back of the kitchen, and any man on this place gives you trouble, he answers to me." He held out his hand. Rough scarred the hand of a man who'd built everything he had from dirt and grief. "That fair, Miss Harper?" Abigail looked at the offered hand. In 15 years of being looked at wrong, of being laughed at and turned away, no man had offered her his hand like an equal. She took it. "That's fair, Mr. Hayes," she said, and down at the end of the table, small and warm and full. For the first time in longer than he could remember, little Toby. Reyes fell asleep, sitting up his cheek, pillowed on his folded arms, safe on a ranch that had learned in a single evening that the biggest heart in the whole Montana Valley had just walked through its gate in a muddy apron and asked for nothing but the chance to prove it. Outside, past the corral, past the barn, past the reach of the warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen windows, a rider sat his horse on the far ridge and watched that light burn. Walter Briggs had heard the talk in Silver Creek, heard Jacob Hayes had taken in a woman. He'd come to see it for himself, and now he'd seen it, and a slow smile spread across his clean-shaven face. He'd wanted Hayes Ranch for 6 long years, and now at last Jacob Hayes had given him a way in. Walter turned his horse toward town and did not look back at the light. Dawn came to Hayes Ranch the next morning before the roosters, because Abigail Harper was already in the kitchen when the roosters woke. She'd slept 4 hours in the little room off the back on a rope bed that sagged in the middle, and she'd risen in the dark and lit the fire and set the coffee to boil. Real coffee ground fresh. None of that boiled to tar slop the men had suffered. By the time the first hand came dragging into the yard, rubbing sleep from his eyes, the smell of frying bacon and hot biscuits had reached clear across to the bunkhouse, and Cole came through the kitchen door at a near run. "Ma'am, is that—" He stopped. He stared at the table. "Is that for us?" "It's for whoever's hungry," Abigail said, not turning from the stove. "Sit down before it goes cold. Coffee's by your elbow." Cole sat. He looked at the plate she set in front of him, like a man who couldn't quite believe his luck, and then he bowed his head and said grace over it, which was a thing Abigail hadn't seen a ranch hand do in longer than she could remember. When he finished, he looked up and caught her watching, and his ears went red. "My ma taught me," he said, before she passed. "Said you always thank God for a meal like this, on account of you don't get many." "Your ma was right," Abigail said quietly. "You keep on saying it, Cole. Don't let anybody laugh you out of it." The other men filed in behind him. Dutch came last, and he stood in the doorway a moment with his hat in his hands, which was not a thing Dutch was known to do, and then he crossed to the table and sat without a word. Abigail set his plate down. He looked at it, and he looked at her, and he opened his mouth like he meant to say something, and then he closed it again and just nodded once, short and hard. "Eat," she told him. "You'll make it up to me by not burning down my kitchen." Dutch snorted, but it was the first thing close to a real laugh anybody had aimed at her that wasn't cruel, and Abigail let herself feel it for exactly 1 second before she turned back to the stove. By the third day, she had the kitchen running like a well-oiled gun. She'd gone through this whole cellar and the smokehouse and the dry goods store, and she'd found more waste than a body could believe. Whole sacks of beans left to rot in the damp. Salt pork gone gray for want of proper hanging. Dried fruit the mice had gotten into because nobody'd thought to seal the barrel. She hauled every bit of it out and started fresh, and she kept a ledger of her own, a little water-stained notebook, where she wrote down every pound of flour and every side of beef that came into that kitchen and every meal that went out of it. Jacob Hayes found her at it on the 4th evening, hunched over her notebook by lamplight after the men had gone to their bunks. "What's that you're writing?" he said from the doorway. Abigail didn't startle. She'd heard his boots on the porch. She'd learned the sound of him, already the heavy, even tread of a man who never hurried and never wasted a step. "Accounts," she said. "Every man on this place ought to know where his food goes. You've been losing money out this kitchen for years, Mr. Hayes, and you never knew it." Jacob came in and stood over her shoulder and looked at the neat columns of figures. He was quiet a long moment. "You read and write," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "My mother saw to it," said a woman with letters, and a woman with a skillet could survive most anything the world threw at her. Abigail closed the notebook. She was half right. Which half was she wrong about? Abigail looked up at him. The lamplight was kind to his hard face, softened the lines a little, and for a moment he didn't look like the grim mountain of a man who'd tried to send her packing 4 days ago. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, and had been carrying it alone for a long time. "She reckoned a skillet and some letters would be enough to keep a person from being lonesome," Abigail said. "That's the half she got wrong." Jacob held her eyes a beat longer than a man ought to. Then he cleared his throat and looked away, and something passed between them, in that little kitchen that neither one of them would have named out loud, not for all the cattle in Montana. "You did right by that boy," he said. "The one you fed in the yard, Toby. Where is he? I ain't seen him since supper the first night. Sent him back to his people. His ma's a widow woman down the creek, 4 young ones, and no man husband got killed in the same mine cave-in that—" Jacob stopped himself. Abigail went very still. "The same one that killed my Samuel," she said quietly. Jacob turned back to her. "Your husband died in the Silver Creek mine. 2 years ago, this coming fall. Cave-in on the lower shaft. 11 men. They didn't even bring most of them up." Abigail's hands went flat on the table. "I buried an empty box, Mr. Hayes. There wasn't nothing to put in it. I dug the grave myself because his own brother wouldn't leave off drinking long enough to lift a shovel, and after it was done, that same brother told me I'd best find somewhere else to be, on account of a widow's just another mouth." His words, just another mouth. The kitchen was silent. Outside a coyote called, and another answered it far off in the dark hills. "That's why you cook," Jacob said slowly, understanding coming into his voice. "You look at a hungry person, and you see—" "I see somebody nobody wants to feed," Abigail said. "Yes, I know what that feels like. So I feed them. It's the one thing in this world I can do that nobody can take from me. They can laugh at my body all day long. They can't laugh at my biscuits." Jacob Hayes looked at her for a long moment, and then he did a thing Abigail did not expect. He pulled out the bench across the table, and he sat down this hard, silent man who trusted no stranger, and he set his hat on the table, and he said, "Toby's ma, Delia Reyes. She and them children are half starved down there. I've sent flour when I could, but I ain't much of a hand at knowing what a family needs." How far's the creek? 2 miles. Why? Abigail was already rising, already reaching for a basket. Because tomorrow's baking day, and I always make too much bread. Been making too much bread my whole life. Somebody ought to eat it. And that was how it started. She didn't ask his permission. Not really. She just began. Every baking day, she made extra 4 loaves, 6, and she'd walk them down the creek in the cool of the morning to the Reyes place, where Delia Reyes stood thin as a fence rail in a doorway with 4 hungry children behind her skirts. The first time Delia wouldn't take the bread. Pride. Abigail knew pride. She'd worn it like armor her whole life. "I don't take charity, ma'am," Delia said, chin up, though the children's eyes were fixed on the basket like it held gold. "This ain't charity," Abigail said. "This is a trade. I got no one to mend for me, and my sewing hand's clumsy as a bear's. You mend, I hear tell. So you mend my aprons and my shirts, and I'll bring bread, and we'll call it square, and neither one of us has to say a word about charity ever again." Delia's eyes filled. She looked at the bread, and she looked at her children, and she looked at this large, kind woman on her doorstep who'd found a way to help her without shaming her, and she stepped back and held the door open. "You'd best come in then, Miss Harper," she said, her voice thick, "and I'll get my needle." Within 2 weeks, half the valley knew that the fat cook up at Hayes Ranch was feeding the Reyes widow and her young ones. Within 3 weeks, she was doing more than that. She taught Cole and 2 of the younger hands how to salt and smoke meat proper, so it'd keep through the winter, because winter came early and hard in those mountains, and a ranch that lost its stores, lost its men. She showed Pete's wife come up from town to visit how to put up jars of stewed fruit so they'd not spoil. She sent soup down the creek when the Reyes' littlest took a fever, and she sat up 2 nights with that child herself, spooning broth between his cracked lips, until the fever broke on the 3rd dawn, and Delia Reyes wept into Abigail's shoulder and called her the answer to a prayer. The ranch changed. A man couldn't have said exactly how, but it changed. The hands worked harder because they ate better and slept sounder. They fought less. Cole stopped stammering when he talked and started standing straighter. Even Dutch Hard-Bitten Dutch took to whittling little toys of an evening, horses and dogs and a tiny wagon. And one baking day, Abigail found them tucked in her basket with a scrap of paper that said "Only for the Reyes kids" in a rough, uneven hand, and she never let on she knew who'd left them. And Jacob Hayes smiled. Not often. Not much. But he smiled, and the hands noticed because their boss hadn't smiled in 3 years. Not since his young wife Sarah had taken a fever one winter and died in that very house with him helpless beside her. And he'd shut himself up hard as a fist ever since, and let no living soul close. He was closer now. Everyone could see it but the 2 of them. He took to lingering in the kitchen after supper. He'd sit with his coffee and his account books, and Abigail would sit with her ledger, and they'd work in a comfortable quiet that neither one had known in years. And sometimes he'd tell her about the ranch, about the drought 3 summers back, that nearly broke him, about the cattle prices, and the railroad, and the bank in Silver Creek. And sometimes she'd tell him about her mother's kitchen in Ohio before the war took her father, and hard times took everything else, and how she'd learned that a good meal was the only sermon that never needed words. "You ever think of going back?" Jacob asked her one night. "To Ohio. Ain't nothing to go back to." Abigail turned a page in her ledger. "Ain't nothing anywhere really. I've been 3 years on the road, Mr. Hayes, town to town cooking, where they'd have me and moving on when they wouldn't. This is the longest I've stayed any place since Samuel died." "Why?" His voice was low. "Why'd you stay here?" Abigail didn't look up. She couldn't quite. "Because it's the first place that let me," she said. "That's all. First place that saw the work before the woman." Jacob was quiet a while. Then he said, "That's a sorry thing, that it took you 3 years to find one." "It's the world we got," Abigail said. "No use crying about it." But she was wrong that it was the world they had, or she was only half right, because there was another world coming for them, and it rode into the Hayes yard one clear morning in the person of Walter Briggs. Abigail was hanging wash when she heard the horses. 2 riders coming up the road easy, and she knew before she saw the man's face that this was trouble, because trouble in that valley always came dressed fine and sitting a fine horse and smiling too much. Walter Briggs was smiling now. He was a handsome man in a hard-polished way, clean-shaven where the ranchmen were rough-dressed in a coat that cost more than a hand made in a season, and he reined up in the yard and looked down at Abigail with an expression she'd worn the memory of for 15 years. He looked at her body first. "Well," Walter Briggs said, and the smile widened. "So it's true." "Can I help you, mister?" Abigail set down her basket. "I'm looking for Jacob Hayes. He's out with the herd, back by noon. You're welcome to wait and I'll bring you coffee, but I'd ask you to state your business being as I run this house." "You run this house?" Walter Briggs turned that over, slow tasting it, and the second rider beside him, a narrow-faced man with a lawyer's soft hands, gave a thin little laugh. "You hear that, Fenwick? She runs the house." He leaned down over his saddle horn. "And what would your name be that runs Jacob Hayes's house?" "Abigail Harper. I'm the cook." "The cook." Walter Briggs let the word sit there between them like a thing he'd caught and meant to gut. "Is that what they're calling it now?" Abigail felt the old heat come up her neck, but she'd been insulted by better men than this, and she held her ground. "That's what they're calling it, because that's what it is. Now you can wait civil, or you can ride on, but you'll not stand in this yard and speak to me sideways, mister. Not on Mr. Hayes's land." Something ugly flickered behind Walter Briggs's smile. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, least of all by a woman, least of all by a fat cook widow he'd already decided in his mind was less than the mud on his boots. But he covered it quick because Walter Briggs was a patient man, and a patient man doesn't show his hand. "My apologies, Miss Harper," he said, oily as a lamp. "We got off on the wrong foot. I'm a neighbor of Jacob's, Walter Briggs. I own the Bar B other side of the ridge and about half the paper in this valley besides. I'll wait for him, and I'll take that coffee, and I'll thank you for it." He swung down off his horse, and as he passed her to tie up at the rail, he said low just for her, "You look real comfortable here, Miss Harper. Real settled. I surely do hope it lasts." Then he was gone toward the porch, and the lawyer Fenwick after him, and Abigail stood in the yard with her wash basket and a cold feeling opening up in her chest like a door onto winter. Jacob came back at noon and found Walter Briggs on his porch, and Abigail bringing out the coffee. Saw her employer's whole face change, go flat and hard, and close the way it had been the first day she'd met him. "Walter," Jacob said. He didn't offer his hand. "What do you want? Now is that any way to greet a neighbor?" Walter Briggs settled back in the chair like he owned it. "I came to talk business, Jacob, same as always. Your loan's coming due at the bank. That north section you mortgaged after the drought. I hold that paper now. Bought it off Hendricks last month." The coffee cup went still in Abigail's hand. Jacob's jaw worked. "That loan's not due till spring." "It's due when I say it's due near enough. There's a clause. Fenwick here can walk you through it. He's a lawyer. That's what I keep him for." Walter smiled up at Abigail. "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Harper. It's real good. Everything about this place has gotten real good all of a sudden. Wonder why that is." "Leave her out of it," Jacob said, and there was a warning in it low as thunder. "Out of what I paid the woman a compliment." Walter spread his hands, all innocence. "Though I'll tell you plain, Jacob, as a neighbor and a friend folks in town are talking. A widower and a woman living under one roof unwed. It don't look right. Fellas got creditors and creditors get skittish when a man's household looks improper. It's just business, you understand. Get off my porch. I'm going." Walter rose unhurried and set his hat on his head. He looked at Abigail one last time up and down slow, and the look was worse than any word. "You take care now, Miss Harper. It'd be a shame if anything happened to spoil all this nice comfort you found." Then he and his lawyer mounted up and rode out, and the dust of them hung in the yard a long time after. Abigail set the coffee down on the porch rail because her hands weren't steady enough to hold it. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "What was that?" Jacob didn't answer right away. He watched the road where the riders had gone. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and cold and full of a hate that had years behind it. "That was Walter Briggs," he said. "And he's wanted this ranch for 6 years. Every scrap of land and debt he could get his hands on. He's got the bank in his pocket. He's got half the town owing him. And he's had his eye on Hayes Ranch since the day he laid eyes on the water rights." Jacob's hands closed on the porch rail. "I never had a way in for him to use. Not till now. Not till me," Abigail said. Jacob turned. "Don't you say that? It's true though, ain't it?" She kept her voice steady. "He aims to use me, to make the town talk, to spook your creditors and call in that loan. A woman like me living here unwed, it's the easiest thing in the world to make it look dirty." She swallowed. "Maybe I ought to go, Mr. Hayes. Maybe—" "No." The word came out of Jacob Hayes hard as a rifle shot. "No. You will not run off this ranch on account of Walter Briggs. Do you hear me? You've done nothing wrong. You've done nothing but good since the day you got here. I won't have you driven off for it. I'd sooner lose the north section. I'd sooner lose the whole outfit." Abigail looked at him. "You don't mean that." "I mean every word." And the way he said it, low and fierce, was the closest thing to a declaration either of them had come to, and it hung in the air between them, and Abigail felt something in her chest that she had told herself she would never feel again. She turned away before he could see her face. "Then we'd best get to work," she said. "If that man's coming for this ranch, he'll come with paper and lawyers and lies. And the only thing that beats a lie, Mr. Hayes, is the truth wrote down plain in a book where a judge can read it." She picked up the cold coffee. "I keep good accounts. You'll be glad of that before this is done. But Walter Briggs did not come with paper first. He came with poison. It started in Silver Creek in the mercantile and the church and the barber shop. The way poison always starts quiet, a word here, a look there. Abigail heard it first from Delia Reyes, who came up the creek pale and worried one morning, with her mending done and her jaw set. "They're saying things, Abigail," Delia said. "In town. About you and Mr. Hayes." "Let them say things." "It's ugly things. They're saying—" Delia's face colored. "They're saying you trapped him, that you're after his land through his bed, that a man like Jacob Hayes wouldn't never look twice at a woman like you unless you'd worked some kind of a scheme on him." Mrs. Pettigrew at the church said it right out loud after service. Said it was a scandal, a fat spinster widow living up here, and that decent folks ought not do business with Hayes Ranch till he sent you packing. Abigail kept kneading her bread. She kept kneading it because if she stopped, her hands would shake, and she didn't want Delia to see her hands shake. "And what did you say?" Abigail asked, when Mrs. Pettigrew said that. Delia Reyes drew herself up thin as she was 4 children clinging to her skirts, and her voice rang out clear in that kitchen. "I said Mrs. Pettigrew ought to be ashamed. I said that woman up at Hayes Ranch sat 2 nights running with my sick baby and never asked a penny nor a word of thanks. And I said any town that'd rather my children starved than let a good woman feed them had best look to its own soul before it looks to hers. I said it in front of the whole congregation, Abigail." Delia's chin trembled. "And then I walked out, me and mine. And we won't be going back to that church, not while they say such things about the only friend I got in this world." Abigail stopped kneading. She came around the table, this large woman, and she took thin, worn Delia Reyes into her arms, and the 2 widows stood there in the flour-dusted kitchen, and held on to each other, and neither one of them said another word for a long while, because some things are too big for words. "You didn't have to do that," Abigail finally said. "You've got them children to think of. You need that town's goodwill more than I do." "I need a clean conscience more than I need Mrs. Pettigrew's goodwill," Delia said fiercely. "You taught me that, not with words, with bread. Now you dry your eyes because I can see them wet, even if you won't let them fall, and let's get this baking done." But the poison spread faster than bread could counter it. Walter Briggs was thorough. Within a fortnight, the feed store in Silver Creek regretted it could no longer extend Hayes Ranch its usual credit. The blacksmith was suddenly too busy to shoe Jacob's horses. A cattle buyer who'd dealt with Jacob for 8 years sent word he'd be looking elsewhere this season. No offense meant just business. 2 of Jacob's own hands' older men with families in town came to him, shamefaced, and quit saying their wives couldn't hold their heads up in church, and though Jacob paid them fair and wished them well, Abigail saw what it cost him to watch his men driven off by lies. It cost her more, because she knew in the deep, cold part of herself that had learned the world's cruelty young that she was the reason. That every door closing on Jacob Hayes closed because she stood in his kitchen. And late one night, she found herself in the little room off the back, her mother's cookbook open on her knees, and she was folding her few dresses into her carpet bag with hands that would not stop shaking. She would go. She would slip out before dawn, before Jacob woke, before anyone could stop her, and she would take the road out of the valley, and Walter Briggs would have no more weapon to use, and Jacob Hayes could keep his ranch and his good name and his men, and she would go on the way. She'd always gone on town to town, cooking where they'd have her, and this place would become just another warm light she'd walked away from. She had her bag near packed when the knock came at her door. It was soft, uncertain. Not Jacob's knock. She opened it and found Cole standing there in the dark hat in his hands, 18 years old and looking younger. "Ma'am," he said, "I saw your lamp. I couldn't sleep. He stopped. His eyes fell to the carpet bag on the bed, and his young face crumpled. "You're leaving." "Cole, you can't leave," his voice cracked. "Ma'am, you can't. Before you came, I ate slop and I slept cold, and I didn't have nobody in this world since my ma died. And you learned me to salt meat, and you learned me my letters better, and you fed me, and you never once, not one time, made me feel small for not knowing things." Tears stood in the boy's eyes, and he let them. He was too young yet to have learned to be ashamed of them. "If you go on account of what them town folks say, then they win, and they don't deserve to win. You're the best thing ever happened to this ranch, ma'am, and if you leave in the night without saying goodbye, I'll never forgive it, not ever." Abigail stood in the doorway with the lamp in her hand and her packed bag on the bed, and something broke open in her chest that she'd kept locked a long, long time. "Sit down, Cole," she said softly. "Sit down and let me make you some warm milk and we'll talk." She unpacked the bag. She unpacked it slow, dress by dress, while Cole watched from the kitchen bench with his warm milk, and by the time the last dress was back in the little bureau, Abigail Harper had made up her mind, and it was the opposite mind from the one she'd carried into that room. "I'm not running," she said, to Cole, to herself, to the dark. "I've been running 3 years and I'm tired of it. A person who runs from every lie spends her whole life running, because there's always another lie. No, I'm going to stay right here and I'm going to keep on doing good and let them make of it what they will, and if Walter Briggs wants to fight, then by God, he'll have a fight." "Yes, ma'am," Cole breathed like she'd hung the moon. What Abigail didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Jacob Hayes had been standing in the dark of the porch the whole time. He'd seen Cole's lamp, too. He'd come to see what the boy was about, and he'd stopped short of the kitchen door when he heard the voices, and he'd stood in the dark and heard every word. He'd heard her near pack her bag and near leave him without a word to spare him to protect his ranch at the cost of herself. And he'd heard her change her mind. He'd heard her decide to stay and fight. And standing there in the dark, Jacob Hayes understood a thing about himself that he'd been running from harder than Abigail had ever run from any town. He was in love with her. He, Jacob Hayes, who had buried his heart with Sarah 3 winters gone and sworn never to open it again, had gone and fallen clean in love with a fat widow cook who kept better accounts than his banker and fed hungry children down the creek, and had just decided to stand and fight a war she never asked for, rather than shame him by running. He didn't go in. He wasn't ready. A man who'd kept his heart shut 3 years doesn't open it in one night on a dark porch. But he went back to his room, and he lay awake till dawn, and for the first time since Sarah died, the thing keeping him awake wasn't grief. The next morning, Walter Briggs made his first real move. He didn't come himself. He sent the sheriff. Sheriff Tom Dunbar was not a bad man, only a weak one, and weak men in a valley owned by Walter Briggs did what Walter Briggs told them. He rode up mid-morning, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, and he wouldn't meet Jacob's eye when he handed over the paper. "What's this?" Jacob said. "It's a complaint, Jacob, sworn out in town, regarding the, Dunbar cleared his throat and looked at his boots. "Regarding the moral character of your household. There's a county ordinance, public decency. It's asking the county to look into whether this ranch is being run in a fit and proper manner given the living arrangements." Abigail had come out onto the porch. She stood beside Jacob and read the paper over his arm, and her face went white, then hard. "Who swore this out?" she said. Dunbar wouldn't say. "It's Briggs," Jacob said. "We both know it's Briggs. There's to be a hearing." Dunbar went on miserably. "County commissioners. 3 weeks from Thursday. If they find the household's not fit and proper, there's things that can follow. Fines. And it goes to your credit, Jacob. A ruling like that, the bank could call your paper. That North loan." He finally looked up, and there was real regret in his tired eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't hold with none of this. But I got no choice. It's all legal. That's the hell of it. He's doing it all legal." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Abigail Harper stepped forward, and she took the paper out of Jacob's hand, and she read it through once more, top to bottom, slow and careful, the way her mother had taught her to read a thing before she signed it, or fought it. And when she looked up, the white had left her face entirely, and what was left was something Jacob had not seen in her before, something that made even Sheriff Dunbar sit up straighter in his saddle. It was not fear. It was not shame. It was the cold, clear fury of a woman who has been pushed exactly one step too far. "A hearing," Abigail said. 3 weeks from Thursday, in front of the county commissioners, where I can stand up and speak." "Yes, ma'am," Dunbar said. "You'd have the right to speak, to answer the complaint, to answer it." A slow, dangerous smile came over Abigail's face. "Sheriff, you go on back to whoever sent you, and you tell them Abigail Harper will be at that hearing. You tell them she'll be there early, and she'll bring her books, and she'll bring the truth, and she will answer every last word of this filthy paper. You tell them that." She folded the complaint carefully and tucked it in her apron. "And you can tell them one thing more. Tell them I have been laughed at, and turned out, and starved and buried the only man who ever loved me with my own 2 hands, and there is not one thing left in this world that Walter Briggs can do to frighten me. Not one. You tell him that word for word." Sheriff Dunbar looked at her a long moment. Then something almost like a smile touched the corner of his tired mouth, quickly hidden. "I'll tell him, ma'am," he said. And he tipped his hat to her, which was a thing no man in Silver Creek had done for Abigail Harper in 3 years, and he turned his horse and rode away. Jacob turned to her. "Abigail, do you understand what this is? If they rule against us, the bank calls the loan, and I can't pay it, not with the feed store, and the buyers all turned against me. I lose the north section, maybe the whole ranch. Briggs takes it for the price of the debt. This is how he wins, not with guns, with paper and shame." "I understand it fine," Abigail said. "Better than you do, maybe. I've been fought with shame my whole life, Mr. Hayes. It's the only weapon they ever used on me, because it's the only one that works on a woman like me." She looked out at the road where Dunbar had gone. "But shame only works if you believe them. And I stopped believing them a long time ago. I know what I am. I know what I've done since I got here. And no county commissioner and no rich man's paper is going to tell me any different." She turned and went back into her kitchen. But Jacob followed her, and he caught her arm gentle at the door, and she stopped. "Why?" he said. "Why are you doing this? You could go. You near went last night, I heard you. I stood on that porch and heard the whole thing. You could walk away from all of this, and Briggs would have nothing. Why stay and fight a war that isn't yours?" Abigail looked down at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. "It became mine," she said simply. "The day this ranch became my home. The first home I've had since I was a girl. A body's got to fight for her home, Mr. Hayes. Even a body like me. Especially a body like me. Because if I run now, then every town that ever laughed me out its gates was right about me." and I have spent 15 years, and I have buried a husband, proving they were wrong." Her voice dropped quieted, and there was something in it that reached down into the oldest wound in Jacob Hayes and touched it. "I'm done running from people who never looked past my body long enough to see there was a person standing inside it. I'm going to stand in that hearing, and I'm going to make them look, all of them, whether they want to or not." Jacob Hayes let go of her arm. And then he said the thing he'd been holding since the dark porch, the thing he wasn't ready to say, and said anyway, because some things won't wait for a man to be ready. "You won't stand there alone," he said. "Whatever comes, whatever they say, I'll be standing right beside you, Abigail. From now till it's done. That's a promise." Abigail Harper looked up at this hard, silent man who'd tried to send her packing 3 weeks ago. This man who never trusted strangers, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, she'd rebuilt with her own 2 hands, offering to stand beside her against the most powerful man in the valley. "I know I will, Jacob," she said quietly. First time she'd used his given name. "I know I will." And in the 3 weeks that followed, the whole valley learned that they had badly misjudged the fat cook up at Hayes Ranch. Because Abigail Harper did not spend those 3 weeks weeping or hiding or begging. She spent them working the way she'd always worked, only now she worked with a purpose sharp as a skinning knife. She sat up nights with her ledgers cross-checking every figure, building a record so clean and complete that no lawyer in the territory could poke a hole in it. Every pound of flour bought and spent, every meal served, every dollar saved since she'd taken over the kitchen, and it was a good deal of dollars more than Jacob had guessed, because a ranch that stops wasting food is a ranch that stops bleeding money. She wrote letters to the widow Reyes asking would she testify, to Cole and Pete and Dutch and every hand who'd eaten at her table. To the families down the creek she'd fed, to the children she'd nursed, to a traveling preacher who'd sheltered from a storm one night and left with a full belly and a blessing. And she baked. Lord, she baked. Because Abigail Harper had learned one truth deeper than any other, and it was this: you cannot argue a person into respecting you, but you can feed them, and a fed person remembers. Word went round the valley, quiet at first, then louder, that whatever the town said, the Hayes Ranch cook was a good woman, and there were folks prepared to stand up and say so. Dutch found her one evening at her ledgers, and he stood in the doorway a while the way he did, and then he came in and set something on the table in front of her. It was a small, carved wooden cross, worked fine and smooth, a thing that had taken him a good many evenings. "For luck," Dutch said gruffly. "At the hearing. My ma always said a body ought to hold something in her hand when she's scared, so her hand's got something to do besides shake." He looked away. "Not that you'll be scared. You don't scare. But in case." Abigail took up the little cross and closed her hand around it, and she found her throat too full to speak for a moment. "Dutch," she finally said. "The first day I came here you said I probably ate the last 3 cooks." Dutch winced. "I know it. I'm sorry for it. I'm not asking for an apology." Abigail smiled up at him, and it was warm, and it forgave everything. "I'm just saying. You've come a far piece from that man in 3 weeks. I reckon most folks could if somebody just fed them regular and expected something better of them." She closed her fingers tight around the cross. "Thank you for this. I'll hold it. And I won't be scared, but I'll hold it all the same." Dutch nodded once hard and went out quick before either of them could get any more sentimental about it. The night before the hearing, Jacob found Abigail on the porch, sitting quiet in the dark, the little wooden cross in one hand and her mother's cookbook in her lap. "You ought to sleep," he said. "So ought you." He sat down beside her. "Not close, but not far. Tomorrow," he said. "Briggs'll have his lawyer, that Fenwick. He's a snake, Abigail, and he's good at what he does. He'll try to make you look foolish. He'll try to make you cry. He'll say things about your—" Jacob stopped. His hands closed into fists. "He'll say things no man ought to say to a woman. Just so you're ready for it." "I'm ready for it," Abigail said. "I've heard every ugly thing there is to hear about the way I'm made, Jacob. Fenwick can't say a thing to me tomorrow. I ain't already heard 100 times from crueler mouths in worse places with no friend beside me." She looked at him in the dark. "That's the difference this time. This time I've got friends beside me. I never had that before, not once. A person can face down most anything if she's not facing it alone." Jacob was quiet a moment. Then he said low, "You're the bravest person I ever met. Man or woman. I want you to know that before tomorrow, whatever happens. You're the bravest soul I ever knew, and this ranch and everybody on it were better for you being here. I'm better for it." Abigail turned her face away out toward the dark hills so he wouldn't see what his words had done to her. "You'd best go get your sleep, Jacob Hayes," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "We've got a fight tomorrow, and I don't aim to lose it." She sat out on that porch a long time after he'd gone in the wooden cross in one hand and her mother's cookbook in the other, and she thought about her mother and about Samuel and about all the towns that had laughed her out their gates, and about this ranch, this one place in all the world that had let her stay. Tomorrow, they would try to take it from her. Tomorrow, the richest man in the valley would stand up in front of the county and try to prove that a woman like Abigail Harper had no right to a home, no right to respect, no right to be seen as anything more than the size of her body. Abigail Harper closed her hand tight around Dutch's little cross, and she looked up at the cold, bright stars over the Montana mountains, and she made herself a promise, the same kind of promise she'd made standing over an empty grave 3 years before. They would look at her tomorrow, every one of them, and by the time she was done speaking, they would see. The morning of the hearing, Abigail Harper was up before the stars had faded, and she did the one thing she knew how to do better than any other soul in the valley. She cooked. She fried bacon and baked biscuits and made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and she fed every hand on that ranch a proper breakfast, because a woman about to fight for her home was not going to send her men into town on empty stomachs. Cole tried to eat and couldn't, too nervous, and Abigail put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You eat that, Cole. We don't win nothing hungry. We eat, and then we go, and we hold our heads up." And the boy ate. Then she packed her ledgers. Everyone. 2 years of accounts, though she'd only kept them 3 weeks because in those 3 weeks she'd gone back and reconstructed the ranch's whole ruin of a food account from the receipts Jacob had shoved in a drawer and forgotten. She wrapped them in oilcloth against the dust of the road, and she tucked Dutch's little wooden cross into her apron pocket, and she put on her good dress, the one clean dark dress she owned, the one she'd worn to bury Samuel. Jacob was waiting by the wagon. He'd put on his own good clothes, such as they were, and he'd shaved, and he stood by the wagon holding the horses' heads and looking at her come down off the porch, and something moved across his hard face that he didn't try to hide anymore. "You look fine, Abigail," he said quietly. "You look real fine." "I look like a woman going to a fight," Abigail said, "which is what I am. Help me up, Jacob. These old bones don't climb like they used to." He handed her up into the wagon, and he did not let go of her hand right away, and she did not pull it away, and for a moment the two of them just stood there in the gray dawn with their hands joined, and neither one saying a word, because the words were too big, and the fight was too near. Then Jacob climbed up beside her, and Cole and Dutch and Pete and the rest fell in behind on their horses, and the whole Hayes Ranch rode into Silver Creek to answer Walter Briggs. The town had turned out for it. Word of a hearing like this ran through a mountain town like fire through dry grass, and by the time the Hayes wagon rolled up to the county building, the street was thick with people come to see the fat cook get her comeuppance. Come to see Jacob Hayes brought low come for the sport of it, the way people come for a hanging. Abigail felt their eyes on her as Jacob helped her down, felt them go to her body first, the way they always did. Heard the murmur run through the crowd, and she lifted her chin, and she did not let them see it touch her. Mrs. Pettigrew was there at the front in her church bonnet, her mouth pursed up tight and righteous. Walter Briggs was there too, on the courthouse steps, clean and smiling, in his fine coat, the lawyer Fenwick at his elbow, with a leather case full of paper. He watched Abigail come, and he tipped his hat to her slow and mocking. "Miss Harper," he called out loud enough for the crowd. "So good of you to come. I did wonder if you'd have the stomach for it." He let the word stomach hang there, and a few in the crowd tittered, and Abigail understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. "Wouldn't miss it, Mr. Briggs," she called back clear and steady. "A person likes to see justice done." "So they do," Walter said, still smiling. "So they do." The hearing was held in the county building's largest room, and it was packed to the walls, every bench full, folks standing 3 deep at the back. 3 county commissioners sat at a long table at the front, and Abigail read them at a glance the way her mother had taught her to read people. The one in the middle, Commissioner Ellsworth, a heavy older man with tired, honest eyes, he was the one to watch. The one on the left kept glancing at Walter Briggs, and Abigail marked him as bought. The one on the right she couldn't read yet. Fenwick opened for Briggs, and he was smooth as Riverstone. He stood and he addressed the commissioners in a voice like warm oil, and he laid out the complaint, and he did not once, not one single time, say a cruel word. That was the worst of it. Abigail had braced for cruelty and got courtesy, and courtesy was harder to fight. "Gentlemen," Fenwick said, "no one here wishes any harm to Mr. Hayes. He's a respected man, a widower, a hard worker. Which is precisely why this matter is so troubling. Because a man in his position, a man alone, is vulnerable. Vulnerable to influence, to arrangements that might seem innocent, but that the good people of this county cannot help but find, shall we say, irregular." He turned slow and looked at Abigail, and his voice never lost its warmth. "A woman lives under his roof, unwed, sharing his home, his kitchen, his household accounts. We're told she even keeps his books now. And the question this county must ask, gentlemen, in the interest of public decency, is a simple one. Is this a fit and proper household, or has Mr. Hayes in his loneliness been taken advantage of?" The murmur that went through the crowd was ugly. Jacob half rose from the bench, his face dark, and Abigail put her hand on his arm and pressed him back down. "Let him talk," she murmured. "Let him say all of it. The more he says, the more there is to answer." Fenwick talked a good while. He called 2 witnesses. Mrs. Pettigrew, who testified in a quivering, righteous voice that it was a scandal that decent Christian folk were shocked that she'd seen with her own eyes the woman walking down to the Reyes place, bold as brass, that no good could come of such an arrangement. And a feed store clerk, who testified, sweating and refusing to meet Jacob's eye, that Hayes Ranch's credit had gone bad, and there was talk it was because the ranch was being run improper. Fenwick let that sit. Then he turned to the commissioners and spread his soft hands. "I have nothing further, gentlemen. The facts speak for themselves. I'd ask only that this county do its duty and protect its good name." He sat. Commissioner Ellsworth in the middle looked tired. He looked at Jacob. "Mr. Hayes, you've heard the complaint. Do you wish to answer it?" Jacob stood, and Abigail's heart clenched because Jacob Hayes was a good man and a strong man, but he was not a talking man, and she watched him stand there in front of the whole town, with his fists clenched and his jaw working, and she saw him struggle for the words that had never come easy to him. "I'll answer it," Jacob said, and his voice was rough. "That woman has done nothing wrong, not one thing. She came to my ranch looking for honest work, and she's given it harder and better than any hand I ever hired. She feeds my men. She keeps my books straighter than they've ever been. She feeds the Reyes children down the creek out of her own baking, because their pa died in the same mine that—" His voice caught. He pushed on. "There's nothing improper about it. Nothing. And any man who says there is a liar, and I'll say it to his face, Briggs. I'll say it right to your—" "Mr. Hayes." Ellsworth held up a hand, weary. "Sit down, please. Your feeling does you credit, but it isn't evidence. This is the trouble, you understand. It's your word against the appearance of the thing. And appearances—" He sighed. "Appearances carry weight in a county whether we like it or no." Jacob sat shaking with anger, and Abigail saw it plain they were losing. Jacob's honest fury was no match for Fenwick's smooth poison. The commissioner on the left was already half nodding along with Briggs. The crowd had come for a comeuppance, and Fenwick had given them one. In another 10 minutes, they'd rule, and the loan would be called, and Walter Briggs would have his ranch. Unless— Abigail Harper rose to her feet. She rose slow because she was a large woman, and she rose slow, and the whole room turned to watch her do it. And she heard the titter start again, the same titter that had followed her out of a dozen towns. She let it come. She stood there in her burying dress with her ledgers wrapped in oilcloth under her arm, and she waited. And the titter died under the steadiness of her waiting. "Commissioner Ellsworth," she said, "you said it's my word against the appearance of the thing, but I've got more than my word. I've got proof, wrote down in figures that a body can check. Will you let me show it?" Fenwick was on his feet at once. "Gentlemen, this is highly irregular. The woman isn't—" "She's the party complained against," Ellsworth said, and there was the first spark of something in his tired eyes. "The complaint's about her conduct. I reckon she's got a right to answer for her own conduct. Sit down, Mr. Fenwick." He looked at Abigail. "Say your piece, Miss Harper, but say it plain. This isn't a court, and I've no patience for speeches." "I don't make speeches, Commissioner," Abigail said. "I keep accounts. Let me show you what I keep." And then Abigail Harper began to speak, and the whole room went still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't weep. She didn't beg. She unwrapped her ledgers on the table in front of the commissioners, and in a voice as steady and plain as a woman reading a recipe, she laid the truth of her 3 weeks on Hayes Ranch bare before the county. "Here's the food account for Hayes Ranch the month before I came," she said, opening the first book. "Reconstructed from Mr. Hayes's own receipts, which he'll swear to. You see there, $41 spent on provisions. And you see there waste, flour gone to weevils, meat gone gray for want of proper curing, beans left to rot in the damp. I figure the ranch was throwing away better than a third of everything it bought. Call it $14 a month thrown in the dirt." She turned the page. "Here's the account for the 3 weeks since. You add it up, gentlemen. Check my figures. I'll wait. That ranch is spending less on food and feeding more men better than it has in years because I stopped the waste. That's not the account of a woman taking advantage of a lonely man. That's the account of a woman saving him money." Ellsworth leaned forward and looked at the figures. He was a man who'd run a store once before he ran a county, and he could read a ledger, and Abigail had counted on that. "These figures are sound," he said slowly. "They're better than sound. They're honest." Abigail turned another page. "Now here. This is a record of every meal served and to whom. And you'll notice something, Commissioner. You'll notice I fed more than ranch hands." She ran her finger down the column. "Bread to the Reyes family down the creek. Widow woman, 4 children, husband killed in the Silver Creek cave-in 2 years back. Same cave-in that killed my own husband, Samuel Harper, whom I buried with my own hands because his family wouldn't." Her voice never wavered, but something in the room shifted at that some intake of breath. "Soup to the Copland place when their littlest took sick. A hot meal to a traveling preacher caught out in a storm. Bread to the Hendersons when their crop failed. It's all wrote down. Every loaf. Because I keep account of what I give the same as what I spend. Now I ask you, gentlemen." She looked up, and for the first time she let a little iron into her voice. "Is that the conduct of an improper woman? Is a household improper because a woman in it feeds hungry children? If it is, then I don't rightly know what a proper household's supposed to look like, and neither do you, and neither does Mrs. Pettigrew there in her fine bonnet, who I notice has never once walked down that creek to see are those children fed." Dead silence. Then from the back of the room a voice, thin and worn but clear. "She's telling the truth. Every word." Delia Reyes stood up. She'd come in the back, quiet, 4 children scrubbed and combed beside her, and now she stood up thin and trembling in front of the whole town that had shamed her, and she spoke. "My name's Delia Reyes. My husband died in that mine same as hers, and I want to tell you what kind of woman Abigail Harper is." Delia's voice shook, but she didn't stop. "When my baby was dying of fever, that woman walked 2 miles down a dark creek and sat up 2 nights with him spooning broth between his lips, and she never asked me for a penny, nor a word of thanks. When the town wouldn't extend me credit at the store because I'm a widow with no man, that woman found a way to feed my children without ever once making me feel like charity. She said I'd mend her aprons and she'd bring bread, and we'd call it a trade so I could keep my pride. Delia's tears came now, and she let them. You want to talk about proper Mrs. Pettigrew? You stood up in church and called that woman a scandal, and that woman was at that very hour keeping my son alive. So you tell me which of you is the Christian. You tell me, because I know, my children know, and God knows. Delia sat down shaking and gathered her children to her, and the room was so quiet you could hear the little ones breathing. Fenwick rose smooth to fill the silence. A touching testimony. But charity, however admirable, does not address the question of the living arrangement which remains. Then let's address it. Abigail turned on him, and now finally her voice rose not loud, but hard, hard as the frozen ground she'd dug her husband's grave in. You want to talk about the living arrangement, Mr. Fenwick? Let's talk about it plain in front of everybody, since that's what your master paid you to make ugly. I live in a room off the back of the kitchen. Alone. There's a door, and it's got a latch, and it's a good 10 paces, and a wall between my bed and any other soul on that ranch. I cook, I clean, I keep the books, and I sleep alone in a cook's room, the way 10,000 cooks have slept in 10,000 ranch houses across this whole territory, and not one of them ever got dragged in front of a county for it. She stepped toward him. You know why they didn't. You want me to say why, Mr. Fenwick, or have you got the sand to say it yourself? Fenwick's smooth face flickered. Say it, Abigail said. Say the real reason I'm standing here and those 10,000 other cooks never were. Go on. Fenwick said nothing, so Abigail said it. It's because I'm fat. The word landed in that silent room like a dropped plate. Nobody had expected her to say it. You weren't supposed to say it. You were supposed to pretend and dance around it, and let it be the thing everybody thought, and nobody spoke. And Abigail Harper had just laid it on the table in front of the whole county plain as a pound of flour. That's the whole of it, isn't it? She went on, and her voice was steady and terrible. A pretty little cook lives in a rancher's house, nobody blinks, but a fat one does it, and it's a scandal. Because you all decided, every one of you, that a woman shaped like me couldn't possibly be there for any honest reason. That no man would keep me around unless I'd schemed my way in. That the only thing a woman my size could be to a man like Jacob Hayes is a trick or a shame or a joke. She turned from Fenwick to the crowd, to Mrs. Pettigrew, to the commissioners, to all of them. You looked at my body, and you decided you knew my whole story. Same as every town I ever walked into. You saw the size of me, and you never once thought to ask what I could do, or what I'd done, or who I was inside it. Well, I'm telling you now, I stopped that mine widow's baby from dying. I saved this ranch a fortune it was throwing in the dirt. I taught a boy his letters, and taught grown men to salt meat for winter so they don't go hungry. That's who I am. And if you'd rather believe the ugly little story Mr. Briggs paid to have told about me, than believe the plain proof sitting on that table, then the shame's not on my household gentleman. She let it hang. The shame's on this whole town. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Fenwick had gone still. And then Walter Briggs began to clap. Slow. Mocking. He rose from his seat, clapping his gloved hands together with a sound like flat stones knocking, and he smiled his handsome cold smile at Abigail Harper. Well, he said, that's quite a performance. Quite a performance from a woman who blew into this valley 3 weeks ago from God knows where, with no references, no history, no husband to vouch for her, nothing but a wagon and a sad story. You've all heard the sad story now. Mom to what? He turned to the crowd working them, and he was good at it. Abigail had to grant him that he was very good. A widow. Poor thing. Alone in the world. And doesn't she just happen to land in the house of the richest bachelor in the valley? And doesn't she just happen to take over his kitchen, and then his books, and then why his very heart, if the man's foolish enough? And now when honest folk raise a question about it, doesn't she just weep and wave her little account book, and tell us all we're the ones who ought to be ashamed? He shook his head, sorrowful false. I've seen this before, friends. A clever woman knows a lonely man is easy pickings. And the cleverest ones are the ones you'd least suspect. The ones nobody would believe could scheme. The ones who use your own pity against you. It was a good speech. It was a poison speech. And Abigail watched it work, watched the crowd's face, and looked down at the ledgers with new doubt. Because that's what a lie does. A good lie. It makes you doubt the very proof in front of your eyes. And Abigail knew in that moment that facts alone would not win this. Fenwick had courtesy, and Briggs had poison, and between them, they could make her ledgers look like a clever woman's trick. She had told the truth, and told it plain, and it was not going to be enough, because Walter Briggs had just made the truth itself look like a scheme. She needed something Briggs couldn't answer. She needed something that wasn't in any ledger. And that was when Jacob Hayes stood up. He stood slow, and the room turned to him, because everybody knew Jacob Hayes didn't talk. Everybody knew he'd shut himself up like a fist for 3 years, and here he was on his feet with a look on his face that none of them had seen since before Sarah died. "Briggs," Jacob said, "you're right about one thing." The room went still. "You're right that this woman's got hold of my heart." Jacob's voice was rough and low, and it carried to every corner of that silent room. "You said it like it was a crime, like it was a trick she worked. So let me tell you how she worked it, since you're all so curious." He turned not to the commissioners, but to Abigail, and he looked at her the way a man looks at the one thing in the world he's sure of. "She worked it by feeding my men till they stood up straight. She worked it by finding a starving boy in my yard that 30 grown men walked past and getting down in the mud to feed him with her own hands, while every one of us laughed at her. That's the first thing I ever saw her do. She got down in the mud for a hungry child that wasn't even hers in front of people mocking her, and she didn't flinch." His voice thickened. "You want to know how she stole my heart, Briggs? That's how, not with any scheme. With the plain fact that she's the best person I ever met. And I've been 3 years too closed up and grieved to say it out loud. And I'm ashamed it took a rich man's lie in a public hall to make me finally say it." He turned back to the commissioners. "You want to know is my household proper? I'll tell you what my household is. My household is a place where a widow and her 4 children don't go hungry. Where a boy nobody wanted learned his letters. Where hard men eat good food and sleep sound and treat each other decent, and it's all of it, every bit of it, because of that woman standing there. If that's improper, then I don't want a proper household, and you can take your ordinance, and your loan, and your whole rotten town, and be damned to it." His fists were shaking. "But it isn't improper. You know it isn't. Every soul in this room knows it isn't. And the only reason we're standing here is that Walter Briggs wants my north section and my water rights, and he found a way to try and take them by shaming a good woman who never did a wrong thing in her life. That's the truth of this hearing. That's the whole truth of it. And if you've got the sand Ellsworth, you'll say so." He sat down. The silence after was different from the silence before. It had weight to it. It had turned. And then from the benches, a man stood up. It was Pete Gray, in his beard hat in his hand. "I'll say something too if I'm let." Ellsworth nodded and Pete cleared his throat. "I've been on Hayes Ranch 11 years, longer than anybody. And I'll tell you, before that woman came, I was thinking of quitting. Old bones, bad food, no reason to stay. Since she came, I eat like a king, and I got a reason to get up mornings. She's the finest cook and the finest soul ever set foot on that place. And I'll say it under oath on the book, anywhere you like. And I'll say something else." Pete looked around the room at his neighbors. "I'm ashamed of the lot of us. I was there the day she come. I heard the boys laugh at her. I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop it neither, and that's near as bad. We looked at a person's body, and we judged her whole soul by it, and we were wrong, every one of us, and it took a rich man trying to rob a good woman to make me see it. I'm done being ashamed quiet, that's all." Pete sat, and then Cole stood young and shaking. "Me too. She learned me my letters. My ma would have loved her." He sat back down red-faced, and Dutch stood next to him without a word, and just nodded hard and sat. And then something happened that Walter Briggs had not counted on. could not have counted on because it was the one thing his money couldn't buy and his poison couldn't touch. Delia Reyes's oldest boy stood up. Toby. 7 years old, the child Abigail had fed in the mud that first day. He stood up on the bench so he could be seen over the grown folks, and in a piping child's voice that carried clear to every corner he said, "Miss Abby's my friend. She feeded me when I was hungry and nobody else would. She's not bad. You're bad, mister." He pointed one small finger straight at Walter Briggs. "You're the bad one." Out of the mouth of a child, and the whole room, the whole shamed and turning room, let out a sound half a laugh and half a sob, and Mrs. Pettigrew in her fine bonnet put her handkerchief to her face and would not look up. And Abigail Harper, who had not wept when they laughed at her, who had not wept when Fenwick sneered, who had not wept through any of it, felt the tears come now and did not fight them, because these were a different kind of tears entirely. Walter Briggs saw it turning. He saw it turning fast, and desperate men do desperate things. "This is a farce," he snapped, his smooth mask slipping at last. "You'd take the word of a child, a ranch hand, a charity widow who eats the woman's bread. Of course they'll defend her. She's bought them all with a rich man's kitchen. That's the whole scheme, don't you see it? Are you all blind?" "Mr. Briggs." Commissioner Ellsworth's voice cut through, and it was not tired anymore. "You'll wait your turn. I've heard enough turns. This hearing is a mockery. I'll have it. Mr. Briggs." Ellsworth stood slow heavy, and there was something in his risen bulk that quieted even Walter Briggs. "You brought this complaint. You paid Mr. Fenwick to bring it. We all know that too, so let's not pretend otherwise. You said this woman blew in from God knows where with no history a body could check." He looked down at Briggs from the commissioner's table. "But you seem to know an awful lot about her for a man who never met her before 3 weeks ago. You knew she was a widow. You knew she had no references. You knew the day she arrived. Now, how would a busy man like yourself come to know the particulars of a ranch cook's history, Mr. Briggs, unless you'd been looking into her real careful? Unless you'd been watching that ranch, waiting for something you could use?" The room turned to Briggs, and Walter Briggs for 1/2 second had no answer. It was only a 1/2 second. He recovered. But the whole room had seen the smooth man caught flat, and a thing like that can't be taken back. "I keep informed about my neighbors," Briggs said stiffly. "That's all. That's simple prudence." "Is it?" Ellsworth reached down and picked up Abigail's ledger, and he weighed it in his hand, and he looked at it a long moment. "Prudence. Well, I've been a county commissioner 9 years, and a shopkeeper 20 before that, and I know an honest set of books when I hold one, and this is an honest set of books. And I know a manufactured scandal when I smell one, and I've been smelling this one since the complaint crossed my desk with your lawyer's name on it, Mr. Briggs, and Hayes Ranch's north section circled on the county map in your own hand, which you were fool enough to leave attached." He set the ledger down. "I'm not ruling today." The room stirred. "I'm not ruling today," Ellsworth said again, "because a thing's come clear to me that I want looked into proper before I rule on anything. This complaint isn't about a household. It's about a piece of land and a loan and a man who's been trying to buy up this whole valley by fair means and foul for 6 years. And I've a mind to find out just how foul the means have gotten." He fixed Walter Briggs with a hard eye. "There'll be a full hearing. 2 weeks. And it won't just be Miss Harper answering questions, Mr. Briggs. It'll be you. About that loan you bought off Hendricks. About the clause your lawyer says lets you call it early. About the feed store and the blacksmith and the cattle buyer that all turned on Hayes Ranch the same month like somebody leaned on them. I want to see some books, too. Yours." Walter Briggs had gone very pale. "You've no cause," Fenwick started. "I've every cause. This is my county, and I'll look into what I please." Ellsworth banged his hand flat on the table. "This hearing's adjourned. 2 weeks. Everybody go home. And Miss Harper." He looked at Abigail, and his tired, honest face softened. "You keep those books just the way you've been keeping them. They're the cleanest thing that's come across this table in a good long while. Reckon we could use more like you in this valley, not less." It was not a victory. Abigail knew that even as the room erupted around her, even as Cole whooped and Pete pounded Jacob's back, and Delia Reyes wept and clutched her children. It was not a victory. It was only a reprieve, only a delay, only the door of the trap creaking back open a crack. Walter Briggs still held the loan. He still had 2 weeks to bury whatever books Ellsworth wanted to see, to lean on the witnesses, to buy the third commissioner the way he'd bought the second. A cornered wolf is the most dangerous kind, and Abigail had just watched the richest man in the valley get cornered in front of his whole town. He would not forget it, he would not forgive it, and he would come back meaner. She knew all that standing in the noise and the joy of that room, and it kept her from smiling. But she also knew one thing more, one thing that hadn't been true an hour before, and it was this: she was not standing alone anymore. Delia had stood for her. Pete had stood. Cole and Dutch. A 7-year-old boy had pointed his finger at the richest man in Montana and called him bad to his face. And Jacob Hayes, who hadn't spoken his heart in 3 years, had stood up in front of the whole town and spoken it about her. Walter Briggs pushed his way out through the crowd, Fenwick scrambling after with his leather case, and at the door he stopped and looked back, and he found Abigail across the room, and the look he gave her was pure murder. Abigail Harper looked right back at him. She took Dutch's little wooden cross out of her apron pocket, and she held it up where he could see it, and she did not smile, and she did not flinch, and she let him see that she was not afraid. Then Walter Briggs turned and was gone into the street, and the door banged shut behind him, and Jacob's arm came around Abigail's shoulders, steady and warm, and Cole was saying something, and Delia was crying, and Toby was tugging her skirt, asking could they have pie to celebrate. And Abigail Harper stood in the middle of it all with the cross in her hand, and thought 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and it would come to a head. All of it, the loan and the land and the lies and the 6 years of Walter Briggs's greed, and one way or the other it would end. She had bought 2 weeks with the truth. Now she'd have to find a way to make the truth stick before a cornered wolf found a way to bury it. "Pie," she said to Toby, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Yes, honey. We're going to have pie. We're going home, all of us, and we're going to have the biggest pie you ever saw." She looked up at Jacob and at the men gathered close, and at Delia and her children, at all these people who had stood up for her when standing up cost them something. Because whatever comes in 2 weeks, we'll meet it fed and we'll meet it together. And there's not a thing in this world Walter Briggs can do about that. They had their pie that night, all of them crowded around the long kitchen table, and for a few hours, the Hayes Ranch kitchen was the warmest place in Montana. But Abigail Harper did not let the warmth fool her, and neither did she let it fool her men. When the last plate was scraped, and Delia had taken her sleepy children home down the creek with a lantern Jacob insisted she carry, Abigail sat the ranch down at that table, and told them plain what she'd known, since the moment Ellsworth banged his hand and adjourned the hearing. "We didn't win today," she said. "We gotta stay, that's all. 2 weeks. And a man like Walter Briggs cornered in front of his own town, he's more dangerous now than he ever was, not less." She folded her hands on the table. "Ellsworth wants to see Briggs's books. You think Briggs is going to hand them over honest? He's got 2 weeks to burn every page that could hurt him. He's got 2 weeks to lean on that feed store clerk and Mrs. Pettigrew and everybody else who spoke to make them unsay it or run them out. And he's got 2 weeks to buy that third commissioner, the one on the right. I couldn't read, because he sure as sunrise already bought the one on the left." She looked around the table at their sobered faces. "So we don't celebrate. We work, same as always. We find the truth, and we get it wrote down before he can bury it. Because the truth's the only thing we've got that his money can't buy." "How?" Dutch said. "How do we get his books if he's burning them?" And that was the question that hung over Hayes Ranch for 3 days, until the answer walked up the road on foot in the rain at dusk and knocked at the kitchen door. It was the lawyer, Fenwick. He stood in the doorway soaked through, no fine coat, now, no leather case hat in his hands, looking 10 years older than he'd looked in that hearing room. Jacob came up out of his chair with his fists already closing, but Abigail put a hand flat on his chest and stopped him because she'd learned to read a face, and the face on Fenwick was not the face of a man come to make trouble. It was the face of a man who'd run out of trouble to make and didn't know what was left. Miss Harper, Fenwick said. His smooth voice was gone. He sounded hoarse and worn. I'd like to talk to you, if you'll hear me. I understand if you won't. Come in out of the rain, Abigail said. Sit down. I'll get you coffee. Abigail. Jacob started. Coffee, Jacob. The man walked 4 miles in the rain to say something. Least we can do is let him say it dry. She set a cup in front of Fenwick and sat down across from him, and waited the way she'd waited on the courthouse floor, quiet, letting the silence do the work. Fenwick wrapped his hands around the warm cup and stared into it a long moment. I've done a great many things for Walter Briggs, he said finally. Things I told myself were just the law. A clause here, a foreclosure there. A man's got a right to his money, I'd say, and I'd draw up the paper and I'd sleep fine. That's what a lawyer tells himself. He looked up. But I sat in that hearing, and I watched a little boy stand up on a bench and point at Walter and call him bad. And I watched a widow tell how you saved her baby's life, and I watched you say out loud, the thing everybody was too much of a coward to say, that they'd have left you alone if you were thin and pretty. His jaw worked. And I went home, and I couldn't sleep. First time in years, I couldn't sleep over a thing I'd done. Because I'm the one drew up the complaint, Miss Harper. Me. I took a good woman feeding hungry children, and I dressed it up in legal words to make it look like a crime. And I did it for money. The kitchen was silent, but for the rain. Why are you telling me this? Abigail said. Because I know where the books are. Fenwick's voice dropped. The real ones. Not the ones Walter'll show Ellsworth. Walter keeps 2 sets. Everybody like Walter keeps 2 sets. And I know what's in the real ones because I helped him cook the fake ones. He set the coffee down and looked her dead in the eye. That loan he bought off Hendricks, the one with the clause that lets him call it early on Hayes, that clause is forged, Miss Harper. It wasn't in the original paper. Walter had me add it after he bought the note in a hand meant to look like Hendricks's. The original loan doesn't come due till spring. Plain and simple, no early call, no clause. I've got the original draft. I kept it. I keep everything. It's a habit that's about to cost Walter Briggs everything he's got if you and Mr. Hayes have got the nerve to use it. Nobody at that table breathed. Jacob spoke first, low. You're telling me the clause that started this whole thing is a forgery, and you can prove it. I'm telling you I forged it on Walter Briggs's orders, and I'll swear to it in front of Ellsworth and God and everybody. Fenwick's hands were shaking now. It'll ruin me. I'll be disbarred. I might go to prison. Forgery's a crime and I committed it, no way around that. But I'd rather go to prison, an honest man, than stay free the thing I've been. He reached into his soaked vest and drew out a folded paper oilcloth wrapped against the rain, and he set it on the table between them. That's the original loan draft. Hendricks's true hand, no clause. Compare it to the note Walter'll produce, and any judge in the territory will see the forgery plain. It's the whole game, Miss Harper. It's everything. I'm handing you the man who tried to destroy you. Abigail did not reach for the paper right away. She looked at Fenwick a long moment, this ruined man who'd built the trap and now come to unbuild it, and something in her, some deep, hard-won wisdom, made her ask the question that mattered more than the paper. Why should I trust you? She said. You built this whole thing against me. 3 days ago, you stood up and tried to shame me in front of the county. Now you walk in out of the rain with a paper that's a little too perfect. How do I know this isn't Briggs's next move? How do I know he didn't send you here with a forgery of a forgery to trap us into accusing him false, so he can turn it around and ruin us worse? Fenwick stared at her, and then slowly something like respect came into his worn face. You're a careful woman, he said. You'd have made a fine lawyer, Miss Harper. That's exactly what Walter would do, and exactly why you're right not to trust me on my word alone. He nodded at the paper. So don't trust my word. Trust Hendricks. He's alive. He's retired to his daughter's place in Bozeman, but he's alive, and he'll remember what was and wasn't in that loan he wrote. You bring him to Ellsworth's hearing, and you put my draft next to Walter's note, and you let old Hendricks say which one's his true hand. I'm just the man pointing the way. The proof's in Bozeman breathing, and it doesn't owe Walter Briggs a thing. Walter foreclosed on Hendrix's own brother 2 years back. The old man hates him worse than anybody in this valley. And there it was. Not a paper to be trusted or doubted, but a living man who could not be forged, sitting in Bozeman, with a grudge and a memory. Abigail Harper picked up the paper then. "Bozeman's 2 days' ride," she said. "The hearing's in 11. That's cutting it close, but it's not too close." She looked at Jacob. "You'll go. You and Pete. Ride to Bozeman, find Hendrix, and don't come back without him. Not if you have to carry him. Tell him Walter Briggs forged his hand on a loan, and there's a chance to make Walter pay for it. That ought to put him on a horse quick enough." Jacob was already nodding, but Fenwick held up a hand. "There's more you need to know before he rides," the lawyer said. "Because I said Walter keeps 2 sets of books, and the loan forgery, that's just the one Walter used on you. But the real books, the second set, they've got everything. 6 years of it. Every man he squeezed, every clause he forged, every official he paid." Fenwick's voice went very quiet. "Including the 2 he's paying right now. That second commissioner, the one on the left, Walter's had him for years, holds a gambling debt over him. But the third one, the one Miss Harper couldn't read." He paused. "Walter got to him yesterday. I know because I carried the money. $200 and a promise of the water rights off the north section once he takes Hayes Ranch. That third commissioner's bought Miss Harper. Which means in 11 days when Ellsworth calls the vote, it's 2 against 1, and Ellsworth loses, and Walter wins forged clause, or no forged clause, because a bought court doesn't care what's true." The warmth went out of the kitchen entirely. 2 of 3 commissioners bought. It didn't matter what proof they brought if the men who ruled on it were already paid to rule against them. Abigail felt the trap she'd thought she'd pried open snap shut again tighter than before, and she saw the same understanding hit Jacob's face, and Pete's, and Dutch's. "Then it's hopeless," Cole said, young and stricken. "If the vote's already bought, it's not hopeless." Abigail's voice cut across the boy's despair, hard and sudden. "It's just harder. Sit down, all of you, and let me think." And she thought in the ticking silence of that rainy kitchen, the way she thought over a ledger that wouldn't balance, worrying at it from every side until the error showed itself. And then slowly she lifted her head. "Mr. Fenwick, you said the second commissioner's held by a gambling debt. That Briggs owns him through it." "That's right. So he's not a bad man necessarily. Just a trapped one. Trapped the way Briggs traps everybody. Through money and shame." She leaned forward. "And a trapped man, Mr. Fenwick, is a man who wants out. I've been trapped my whole life. I know the look of a person who'd give anything to be free of a thing hanging over them." She turned to Jacob. "You go to Bozeman for Hendrix. That's the proof of the forgery, and we need it. But the vote we don't win with proof. We win it by breaking Briggs's hold on that second commissioner before he ever casts it." "How?" Jacob said. "How do you break a hold like that?" Abigail looked at Fenwick. "How much is the gambling debt?" "Near $300, more than the man makes in a year. And if it were paid, if somebody bought that debt out from under Briggs, the way Briggs bought Jacob's loan out from under Hendrix, then Briggs has got nothing over him. No debt, no shame, no hold." She sat back. "A free man votes his conscience, and I watched that commissioner's face in the hearing. He didn't like what he was part of. He looked sick over it. Free him, and I'd wager he votes honest just to spite the man who owned him. That's near $300, Abigail." Jacob's voice was quiet. "We don't have it. The feed stores cut our credit. The buyers turned on us. The ranch is stretched thin as it's ever been. I couldn't raise $300 in 11 days if I sold every cow I own, and even then, Briggs would just call the loan the second I did." And the kitchen fell silent again, because that was the wall. That was the hard, true wall of it. The trap Briggs had built was made of money, and money was the one thing they didn't have. Then Pete cleared his throat. "I got $80, the old hand said. "Saved 11 years. Was gonna use it to retire on someday. But I ain't got much someday left, and I'd rather spend it on this." He put his gnarled hands flat on the table. $80. It's yours, Miss Harper. Every cent. Pete? Abigail started. I got 22, Dutch said, cutting her off. It's yours too. I got $9, Cole said, and his young voice cracked. It ain't much, but it's yours. And around the table it went, every hand. Emptying his pockets onto the wood, the whole ranch's small, hard-earned savings piling up in front of Abigail Harper. And it wasn't enough. It wasn't near 300, but it was something, and it was given freely. And Abigail looked at that little pile of coins and worn bills, the retirement savings, and the drinking money. And the boy's $9, all of it laid down for her, and for the second time that week, Abigail Harper wept. Stop it, she said, wiping her eyes rough with the back of her hand. Stop it, all of you. You'll have me useless. Put your money away, most of it. I won't take a man's whole savings. She pushed the pile back toward them, taking only careful count. It's a start. It's not enough, but it's a start, and it tells me something I needed to know. It tells me this ranch is worth fighting for because look what's on this table. Look what you'd all give. She stood. Now here's what we do. Jacob and Pete ride for Bozeman at first light for Hendricks. And I'll ride the other way, down the creek and into town and every farm and holding in this valley that Walter Briggs ever squeezed or scared or shamed. Because I'll wager we're not the only ones he's got his hand around the throat of. And a valley full of people he's wronged, if they knew they weren't alone, if they knew somebody was finally standing up to him, they'd give, Delia Reyes said from the doorway. She'd come back up the creek in the rain, the lantern still in her hand come back because she'd forgotten her mending basket, and found instead the whole ranch bent over a table piled with coins. She stepped in dripping, and she set the lantern down. They'd give, she said again, the Coplans, the Hendersons, every family that man ever ground under. I know them, Abigail. I've been poor among them 3 years while you've been on the road. They've got nothing, most of them $1 here, 2 there. But there's a lot of them, and Walter Briggs has hurt every single one, and not a one has ever had the nerve to stand against him, because they always stood alone. Her thin face was fierce in the lantern light. But they wouldn't be alone now, would they? They'd have you, and they'd have the finest woman in this valley telling them it's time. Abigail looked at Delia, and a plan came together in her mind, whole and clear, the way a recipe comes together, each piece finding its place. No, Abigail said slowly. They wouldn't be alone, and neither would we. The 11 days that followed were the hardest and the finest of Abigail Harper's life. Jacob and Pete rode for Bozeman in the gray dawn, and Abigail rode the other way down into the valley she'd only ever passed through, and she did the one thing she'd always done, the only thing she'd ever truly known how to do. She went to hungry people, and she fed them, and she listened. She sat in the Coplans' bare kitchen and heard how Walter Briggs had bought their mortgage and doubled the payment till they near lost the farm. She sat with the Hendersons and heard how he'd diverted the creek that watered their crop to his own land, legal on paper ruin, in fact. Family after family, holding after holding the same story with different names, 6 years of one rich man's patient greed, grinding down everyone too small and too alone to fight back. And to every one of them, Abigail said the same thing. You're not alone anymore. There's a hearing in 11 days, 10 now, 9, and this time we've got him. We've got proof he forged a man's signature, and we've got a way to break his hold on the vote if folks will stand together. It won't cost you much. $1 if you've got it, your voice if you don't. But it'll cost you your fear. You've been afraid of that man 6 years. I'm asking you to be done being afraid, just once. Just long enough to stand up in a county hall and tell the truth about what he did to you. Will you do that? Will you stand if I stand first? And one by one, then 2 by 2, then, in a flood, the valley said yes. The dollars came in worn, and few, but many-handed, and Delia counted them each night by lantern light, and the pile grew. But more than the dollars came the stories written down now in Abigail's careful hand, sworn to, and signed 6 years of Walter Briggs's crimes, gathered up out of the silence he'd counted on, and set down in black ink, where a judge would have to read them. the Copland mortgage, the Henderson water, a dozen more. And every family that signed brought 2 more who'd been too scared to be first, because there is nothing in this world braver than a frightened person who sees that someone else has stood up before them. On the 9th day, a rider Abigail didn't know reined up in the Hayes yard. A hard-faced man, dusty with a federal star on his coat. "I'm looking for the woman keeping the book on Walter Briggs," he said. "They tell me down the valley, her name's Harper." Abigail's heart went cold. A federal man. Had Briggs turned it around already gotten to the law before she could? "I'm Abigail Harper," she said, standing her ground. "What's your business?" "Name's Marshal Coy, United States Marshal Territorial Office." He swung down off his horse. "And my business, Miss Harper, is that I've had a complaint about Walter Briggs's dealings sitting on my desk for a year and a half from a widow he foreclosed on over in the next county, and never enough proof to move on it. Then 3 days ago, I start hearing a fat cook up the Silver Creek Valley is riding farm to farm, collecting sworn statements against the man dozens of them all signed." A slow grin cracked his dusty face. "Miss Harper, I have been trying to build a case against Walter Briggs for 18 months, and you appear to have built it for me in a week. I'd very much like to see that book of yours." And Abigail Harper, who had walked into this valley 3 weeks before with nothing but a wagon and a cookbook, and the laughter of 30 men, stood in the Hayes Ranch yard and understood that the tide had turned at last all the way past any turning back. "Marshal," she said, "come in out of the sun. I'll get you coffee, and I'll show you the book. But you'd best clear your afternoon because it's a long book, and it's going to be longer yet because we've got 2 days till the hearing, and there's more folks coming in to sign every hour." Jacob and Pete rode back on the 10th day mud to their hats exhausted, and behind them, on a steady old mare, rode a white-haired man with a hard jaw and hard eyes. Hendricks come down out of retirement in Bozeman with a grudge 6 years cold and a memory sharp as a tack. He climbed down stiff and slow, and Abigail brought him coffee, and he looked at Fenwick's oilcloth-wrapped draft, and then at the copy of Walter's forged note that Fenwick had provided, and he held them side by side in his gnarled old hands, and his face went dark as a thundercloud. "That's my hand there," he said, tapping the draft. "True as I ever wrote, and that." He tapped the note. "That clause. I never wrote that. Never. There was no early call in that loan, none. I don't hold with early calls. I told every man I ever lent to spring comes due in spring." He looked up, and his old eyes were fierce. "Walter Briggs forged my hand. On my own loan. That thieving low-down he foreclosed on my brother, you know that, 2 years back. Broke him. And now he's forging my name to steal another man's land." He folded the papers careful and looked at Abigail. "Miss, I'd have ridden 10 days for the chance to say that in front of a judge. You just tell me where to stand and when." The night before the hearing, the Hayes kitchen was fuller than it had ever been. Delia and her children. Pete and Cole and Dutch and every hand. Old Hendricks tucked up warm by the fire. Fenwick, quiet and gray, who had not left, who had spent the 11 days helping Abigail get every sworn statement worded so tight no lawyer could shake it, atoning the only way he knew how. Marshal Coy, with his book of federal charges near complete. And the coins on the table counted and recounted, come up at last with the valley's dollars and the ranch's savings, and a loan Marshal Coy himself put in against his own back pay to just past $300. Enough to buy out the second commissioner's gambling debt. Enough to set a trapped man free. Abigail had ridden to that commissioner's house herself 2 days before alone and sat in his parlor and laid it out plain, that she knew Briggs held his debt, that she wasn't there to shame him. That she meant to buy the debt and tear it up and ask nothing in return but that he vote his conscience. And the man, a decent man, ground down by one bad year at the card table, had put his face in his hands and wept because in 6 years nobody had ever offered him a way out. Only a way deeper down. "You'd do that," he'd said. "You'd free me and ask nothing." "I'd ask you to vote honest," Abigail had said. "That's all, not for me, for yourself. So you can look at your own face in the glass again. I know what it is to carry a shame that isn't yours to carry. I'm offering to lift it off you. Whether you vote our way or Briggs's way, after that's between you and God, but you'll vote free." And the man had wept and taken her hand and said he'd vote honest if it cost him everything, because it was the first honest thing anybody had let him do in years. So now, the night before, Abigail Harper stood at the head of her crowded kitchen table and looked at all of it. All these people who 3 weeks ago had been strangers or enemies or nothing at all, gathered now in her kitchen with proof and witnesses and a marshal and a broken lawyer turned honest and a valley's worth of dollars and a freedman's promise, all of it built up out of nothing but bread and truth and the refusal to run. "Tomorrow," she said, "we finish it." She didn't make a speech. She'd told Ellsworth she didn't make speeches, and she didn't. She just looked around the table and her eyes were wet and her voice was steady. "3 weeks ago I came up that road with nothing and 30 of you laughed at me." A few of the men looked at their hands. "And I want you to know I don't hold it against a one of you, because look what you've become since. Look what we've all become. Walter Briggs thought he could beat us because he thought we'd each of us stand alone the way he's made everyone in this valley stand alone for 6 years. He was wrong. He was wrong about the whole thing. The one thing that man never counted on in all his figuring is what happens when the people he's stepped on decide to stand up together." She picked up Dutch's little wooden cross from where it sat by her plate. "So tomorrow we walk into that hall, all of us, and we don't beg and we don't weep for sympathy. We just tell the truth. The whole truth wrote down and sworn to and impossible to bury. And we let it do what the truth does." She closed her hand around the cross. "Now everybody eat and then everybody sleep, because tomorrow's a long day and I don't intend for a single one of us to meet it hungry." They ate, and they slept. And in the gray dawn, the whole of it, the ranch and the valley and the marshal and the witnesses, rolled into Silver Creek to finish what a fat cook had started 3 weeks before. Walter Briggs was waiting on the courthouse steps, Fenwick's absence at his elbow, the first sign that something had gone wrong, though he didn't know yet how wrong. He watched the Hayes wagon come, and then the wagon behind it, and the riders behind that, and the farm families on foot behind them, more and more, the whole valley pouring into town, and Abigail Harper watched his handsome face change as the count of them climbed past anything he could explain, past anything his money could touch. For the first time since she'd met him, Walter Briggs looked afraid. He didn't know about Hendricks waiting in the wagon. He didn't know about the marshal riding easy at the back. He didn't know his own lawyer had turned, or that his forged clause was about to be laid beside the true draft, or that the second commissioner's debt sat torn to pieces in Abigail's apron pocket, or that a valley he'd spent 6 years teaching to fear him alone had just learned to stand together. He knew none of it. He only saw them coming, all of them, more than he could count, and at the front of them, climbing down slow and careful from the wagon, in her one good burying dress, a fat cook widow. He'd tried to grind into the dirt holding a little wooden cross in her hand, and looking at him without one trace of fear. "Miss Harper!" he called out, and this time there was a crack in the smooth of his voice. "What is all this?" Abigail Harper looked at him across the crowded street, and she did not smile, because it wasn't a moment for smiling. It was a moment for truth. "This Mr. Briggs," she said, and her plain, steady voice carried clear over the whole gathered valley, "is what it looks like when nobody stands alone anymore." And she walked past him up the courthouse steps, and the whole valley walked up behind her. The county hall could not hold them all. Folks packed the benches and lined the walls, and stood 3 deep at the back, and spilled out the doors onto the steps. The whole valley come to see the end of it. And Abigail Harper walked up the center aisle through all of them with her ledgers under her arm, and Dutch's little cross in her hand. And she took her seat at the front, and behind her the people of Silver Creek sat down together in a hall, where 3 weeks before they had gathered to watch her be shamed. Walter Briggs came in last, and he came in changed. The smooth was gone off him. He'd seen the size of the crowd, and he'd seen that Fenwick wasn't at his side, and he'd started somewhere in that walk up the steps to understand that the ground had shifted under him, though he couldn't yet see how far. He took his place, and he looked for his lawyer, and his lawyer was not there, and a small muscle worked in his jaw. Commissioner Ellsworth called the hall to order, and the three commissioners took their seats, and Abigail read them again the way she'd read them the first day. The one on the left, Briggs' man held by the gambling debt. The one on the right, the bought one, the $200, and the promise of water rights. And Ellsworth in the middle, tired and honest and waiting. Only now Abigail knew what those two commissioners didn't know she knew. And she watched the one on the left, the trapped one, and she caught his eye for just a moment, and she gave him the smallest nod, and she saw him swallow hard and sit up straighter. A man who'd been set free 2 days before in his own parlor and had promised to vote like it. "We're here to conclude the matter of the complaint against the household of Jacob Hayes," Ellsworth said, "and to look into some questions that arose about how that complaint came to be brought. Mr. Briggs, your lawyer's not present. You want to proceed, or you want time to send for him?" "Mr. Fenwick and I have parted ways," Walter Briggs said stiffly. "I'll speak for myself. I've nothing to hide." "Well," Ellsworth said mildly, "we'll see about that. Miss Harper, you asked to be heard first this time. Go ahead." Abigail Harper rose, and she did not go to her ledgers first. She went to the plainest, hardest truth first, because she'd learned in 3 weeks of riding that valley that you lay the foundation before you build the house. "Commissioner," she said, 3 weeks ago I stood here and showed you my books, and I told you the shame in this valley wasn't on my household, it was on this whole town for judging a woman by her body and never asking what she'd done. And you gave me 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks I didn't hide, and I didn't run, and I didn't beg. I rode this valley end to end. And I found out something, Commissioner, that I think you'd best hear before you rule on anything." She turned slow and faced the crowd and then faced Briggs. "I found out I'm not the only one this man tried to grind into the dirt. I found out he's been doing it for 6 years. And I found out that the only reason he ever got away with it is that he made sure every single person he hurt stood alone." She lifted a thick sheaf of paper from the table. "This is 51 sworn statements. 51 families and men in this valley telling under oath what Walter Briggs did to them. Forged mortgages, diverted water, loans called early on false clauses, threats. I'll enter every one, and every soul who signed is in this room to swear to it, and you can call them up one by one till the sun goes down." The hall stirred, a low sound like wind coming up. Walter Briggs was on his feet. "This is slander. This is a mob. She's whipped up every deadbeat in the county who ever failed to pay me what they owed, and now they're—" "Sit down, Mr. Briggs," Ellsworth said. "I will not sit down while this woman—" "You will sit down, or I'll have the sheriff sit you down." And Sheriff Dunbar, standing by the door, straightened up off the wall, and there was something in his tired face that hadn't been there 3 weeks before, and Walter Briggs looked at him and understood that even his weak-bought sheriff had found a spine somewhere, and he sat. "Now," Ellsworth said, "Miss Harper, these statements are a serious thing, but you know as well as I do that a debtor's got reason to speak ill of the man he owes. Briggs isn't wrong that folks who failed to pay might carry a grudge. What have you got that's more than a grudge?" And this was the moment. Abigail had known it would come to this, that 51 grudges could be waved away as 51 deadbeats, that the truth needed something harder than testimony, needed proof that couldn't be argued or bought. "I've got this," she said. She nodded to the back of the hall, and the crowd parted, and old Hendricks came forward, white-haired and stiff and hard-eyed, and a whisper ran through the room, because half of them remembered Hendricks remembered he'd left the valley 2 years back after Briggs broke his brother. "Commissioner," Abigail said, "this is Mr. Hendricks. He held the loan on Jacob Hayes's north section before he retired to Bozeman. He wrote that loan with his own hand. Mr. Briggs bought that loan, and then Mr. Briggs used a clause in it, an early call clause, to threaten Jacob Hayes and start this whole business, because that clause let him call the debt early and take the land." She turned to Hendricks. "Mr. Hendricks, I'm going to show you 2 papers. This one is the original draft of that loan which came into my hands from the man who kept it. And this one is a copy of the note Mr. Briggs has been holding over Jacob Hayes, the one with the early call clause. I want you to look at them both and tell this hall under oath which one is your true hand." Hendricks took the papers in his gnarled hands. He held them up to the light. He looked at them a long, long moment, and the hall held its breath. "This one," he said, tapping the draft, and his old voice rang out hard and clear, "is mine, true as I ever wrote a thing. And this one." He tapped the note, and his hand shook with fury. "This clause here, this early call, I never wrote it. Never. I don't hold with early calls, never did. And every man in this valley I ever lent to will tell you I said spring comes due in spring. Somebody forged my hand. Somebody added that clause after the fact in a hand made to look like mine, and I'll swear to that on any Bible you put in front of me." He turned and looked straight at Walter Briggs, and his old eyes burned. "And I've got a fair notion who." The hall erupted. Ellsworth banged for order and didn't get it for a full minute. And when the noise finally died, Walter Briggs was standing again, but he was not shouting now. He'd gone pale. "That draft could be forged as easily as anything," he said, and his voice had lost its music. "Where did it come from? Who gave it to her? Some enemy of mine, some—" "I gave it to her." The voice came from the doorway, and the whole hall turned. Fenwick stood there. He'd come after all, gray and worn and steady, and he walked up the center aisle through the parted crowd with his head up, and he stopped before the commissioners, and he did the bravest thing Abigail had ever seen a frightened man do. "My name is Arthur Fenwick," he said. "I was Walter Briggs's lawyer for 9 years, and I forged that clause." A gasp went through the hall. "I forged it on his orders in Mr. Hendricks's hand after Mr. Briggs bought the note specifically so he could call the loan early and take Hayes Ranch. I did it, and I'm ashamed of it, and I've come to say so under oath and take whatever punishment the law hands me for it. I kept the original draft because I keep everything, and I gave it to Miss Harper because I couldn't sleep anymore for what I'd done." He looked at Ellsworth. "I know what this cost me, sir. I'll be disbarred, likely worse. I'm telling you anyway because it's true, and because I sat in this hall 3 weeks ago and watched an honest woman I'd wronged tell the truth, with more courage than I'd shown in my whole life, and I couldn't live another day being the man I'd been." The silence in that hall was absolute, and Walter Briggs, for the first time in 6 years, had nothing to say. His own lawyer stood before the county and confessed the forgery to his face, and Briggs opened his mouth and closed it, and the smooth and the money and the poison all failed him at once, because there is no buying your way out of a man's confession. Then the marshal stepped forward. "Commissioner, if I may." Marshal Coy came up the aisle, and the Federal star on his coat caught the light, and Walter Briggs saw it, and Abigail watched the last of the color drain from his face. "United States Marshal Coy, Territorial Office. I've been building a case against Walter Briggs for 18 months on a foreclosure fraud complaint out of the next county. I never had the proof to move. This week Miss Harper handed it to me, 51 sworn statements and a confessed forgery." He turned to Briggs. "Walter Briggs, I'm placing you under federal arrest for fraud forgery, and I expect a good deal more once I finish reading Miss Harper's book. You'll want to come along quiet." "You can't?" Briggs's voice cracked. "I own half this county. I own the bank I own." He wheeled toward the commissioners, toward the 2 he'd bought, and for one terrible moment, the whole thing hung in the balance, because the vote wasn't cast yet, because 2 of 3 still owed him. "Ellsworth, you can't let this stand. Vote. Call the vote. You two, you know how you're voting, you. And the commissioner on the left, the trapped one, the one Abigail had set free in his own parlor 2 nights before, stood up. "I'm voting my conscience, Walter," he said, and his voice shook, but it held. "For the first time in 3 years, you held a gambling debt over me and made me your dog, and everybody in this valley knew it, and nobody said a word, because that's how you work. You shame a man, and then you own him." He drew a torn scrap of paper from his pocket and held it up, the debt Abigail had bought and torn to pieces. "Miss Harper bought that debt and tore it up and asked me nothing for it. Nothing but that I vote honest. So I'm voting honest. The Hayes household is fit and proper, and the complaint's a fraud, and God forgive me for every day I did your bidding." He sat down, shaking a free man, And Walter Briggs turned wild now to the third commissioner, the one he'd paid $200, and promised the water rights, his last hope. And he found that man staring at the marshal's Federal Star with the face of someone who has just realized which way the wind has turned and which side of it he wants to be standing on when it's over. The third commissioner cleared his throat. In light of the evidence of forgery and the federal marshal's presence, I find I must also vote that the complaint is without merit. Entirely without it. He would not look at Briggs. Fit and proper. That's my vote. 2-0. Before Ellsworth even spoke, and both of Briggs's bought men had turned one from conscience and one from cowardice. And it didn't matter which, because the vote was the vote. Ellsworth banged his hand flat on the table. That's the ruling of this county, he said, and his tired voice rang with something that had been a long time coming. The complaint against the household of Jacob Hayes is dismissed as a fraud brought in bad faith by Walter Briggs to steal a man's land through forgery and shame. The forged clause is void. The Hayes loan stands as Mr. Hendricks wrote it, due in spring, no early call, and Walter Briggs is remanded to the custody of the United States Marshal. He looked down at Briggs, and there was no pity in his tired eyes, only the weariness of a man who'd watched one greedy soul poison a whole valley for 6 years and was glad past words to see the end of it. Marshal, take him. This county's done with him. Marshal Coy took Walter Briggs by the arm. And Walter Briggs, the richest man in the valley, the man who'd owned the bank and the sheriff and 2 of 3 commissioners, the man who'd tried to grind a fat cook widow into the dirt and take an honest man's home, was led out of that hall in front of the whole valley. He'd spent 6 years crushing, and not one soul stood to help him, and not one voice rose to speak for him. Because a man who makes everyone stand alone finds in the end that he is the one who stands alone. At the door, he stopped. He turned. He found Abigail Harper across the crowded hall, and he looked at her with the last of his hate, and he said low and vicious, "You think you've won. A cook. A fat ugly." "I know I've won, Mr. Briggs," Abigail said, and her plain steady voice carried clear over the whole silent hall. "But not the way you think. I didn't beat you with those books or that marshal, or even the truth. I beat you the day I stopped letting you decide what I was worth. You spent 6 years teaching this valley that a person alone is a person you can break. And I spent 3 weeks teaching them they don't have to stand alone. That's the whole of it. That's all I ever did." She looked at him without hate, which was worse than any hate, because it was the look you give a thing you've stopped being afraid of. "You never understood the one thing that matters in all your figuring. A man can own the bank and the water and half the county, but he can't own people who've decided to stand together, and now you don't own anything at all. Goodbye, Mr. Briggs." And Marshal Coy led him out, and the door closed behind him, and Walter Briggs was gone from that valley, and he did not come back. For a moment the hall was silent. Then it broke open like a dam, and the whole valley was on its feet at once, and the noise of it shook the rafters, and Cole was whooping, and Pete was pounding backs, and Delia Reyes was weeping into her hands with her children clinging to her. And old Hendricks was laughing, a dry, cracked laugh he probably hadn't laughed in years, and through all of it, Abigail Harper stood still at the front of the hall, holding Dutch's little wooden cross, and she let it wash over her, all of it. This valley she'd walked into 3 weeks before a stranger, and stood in now, surrounded by people who would have walked through fire for her. And then Jacob Hayes was there. He came through the crowd to her, and he stopped in front of her, and the hall quieted a little around them, because everyone could see what was in the man's face. Everyone but maybe Abigail, who had spent so long not daring to hope that she'd near forgotten how. "Abigail," Jacob said. "Jacob, it's over." His rough voice was thick. "He's gone. The ranch is safe. The loan holds till spring, and we'll pay it. We'll pay it easy now. The buyers'll come back and the town's turned. It's over, and you did it. You did the whole thing." "We did it," Abigail said. "All of us. You started it." Jacob's hands were shaking, this hard man who'd shut himself up for 3 years, shaking now in front of the whole valley. "You got down in the mud that first day for a hungry boy while we all laughed. I keep coming back to that. Everything that happened, all of it, this whole valley standing up, it started because a woman got down in the mud for a child who wasn't hers, while 30 men laughed at her. And I was one of the men laughing. His voice broke. I've been 3 years too closed up to say a true thing to anybody. So I'm going to say it now in front of all of them, because I should have said it a week ago, and I was a coward. Abigail Harper. Jacob. She stopped him, gentle, a hand on his arm. Not here. Not like this. Not in a courthouse with the whole valley watching right after a fight. She looked up at him, and her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady and sure. If you've got something to say to me, you say it at home, at our table, over supper, where it belongs, where everything true between us has ever happened. A small smile touched her mouth. A body ought to be asked proper, even a body like me, especially a body like me. Now take me home, Jacob Hayes. I've got 51 families to feed, and half of them are going to follow us back to that ranch, and I'll be damned if any of them go home hungry on the finest day this valley's seen in 6 years. And Jacob Hayes threw back his head and laughed, really laughed for the first time in 3 years, and he offered Abigail his arm, and she took it, and the two of them walked out of that county hall together, and the whole valley walked out behind them. They did go back to the ranch, and half the valley did follow, and Abigail Harper fed every last one of them because that was who she was, and it was what she did, and it was the truest thing about her. She fed them till the sun went down, and the stars came out over the Montana mountains, and the Hayes ranch yard, that had once erupted in cruel laughter at the size of a widow's body, rang instead with the laughter of children she'd fed, and men she'd saved, and a whole valley she'd taught to stand together. But Jacob did not ask her that night. She'd told him to ask her proper at their table over supper, and Jacob Hayes was a man who did a thing right when he did it at all, and so he waited. He waited through the rest of that summer, through the harvest that came in richer than Hayes Ranch had seen in years, now that the buyers had come back, and the town had turned, and the water ran honest again down to the Henderson place, and the Copland mortgage had been set right by a court that no longer feared Walter Briggs. He waited while Abigail's kitchen became the beating heart of the whole valley, while families who'd never dared visit came now for supper and stayed for warmth. While Delia Reyes and her children near lived at that ranch, while Cole grew into a young man who stood straight and read his letters fine and never once forgot to say grace. He waited while the ranch healed and the valley healed, and Abigail Harper, for the first time in 3 years, stopped being a woman passing through and became a woman who belonged. He waited through this fall and the first snow and the long white Montana winter, and Abigail's kitchen kept the whole valley fed and warm through it, and not one family within a day's ride went hungry that winter because the fat cook up at Hayes Ranch would not allow it. And he waited until spring. Spring came late and sudden to the mountains the way it does. The snow gone almost overnight, and the creek running high, and the first green pushing up through the mud, and Abigail planted a garden beside the ranch house. A real garden. The first thing she'd ever planted anywhere, because you don't plant a garden in a place you mean to leave, and Abigail Harper did not mean to leave, not ever again. It was a warm evening in that first true spring, after the supper things were cleared, and the hands had gone to their bunks, and Delia had taken her children home down the creek that Jacob Hayes finally asked. They were alone in the kitchen, the two of them, the way they'd been near every evening for the better part of a year. Abigail at her ledgers, and Jacob with his coffee, the fire low, and the window open to the spring dark, and the smell of turned earth coming in from her new garden. And Jacob set down his coffee, and he cleared his throat, and Abigail knew the way a woman knows, and she set down her pen. "Abigail," Jacob said, "I've been waiting near a year to say this proper. You told me to ask you at our table over supper where everything true between us happens. Well, supper's cleared, and it's our table, and this is me asking." His rough hands were folded on the wood still now, not shaking, because a man who's waited a year and is finally sure of a thing doesn't shake. "I'm not asking because you need me. You don't need any man. You proved that to this whole valley. You proved it to Walter Briggs and the county and God and everybody. You're the strongest soul I ever knew, and you'd get on fine without me till the end of your days." He looked at her, and his hard, weathered face was open all the way open, the way it hadn't been since before Sarah died, open the way it had never been for anyone but this woman. I'm asking because life is better when you're here. That's the whole of it. That's the truest thing I know. Every good thing that's happened to this ranch, to this valley, to me in a year, came in the door the day you did. I stopped being a closed-up grieving man the day you got down in that mud. And I don't want to spend one more supper at this table without knowing you'll be across it from me the rest of my life. He drew a breath. Marry me, Abigail Harper. Not because you need saving, because I'd be a fool to let the best person I ever met walk out of my kitchen. Marry me. Yidishitki. Abigail Harper sat very still. She thought about the last 3 years. She thought about the empty box she'd buried, and the grave she'd dug alone, and the brother who'd called her just another mouth. She thought about every town that had laughed her out, its gates, every door that had closed on her, every man who'd looked at her body first, and never once looked at her face. She thought about the girl her mother had raised, who'd been taught that a skillet and some letters would keep her from being lonesome, and how her mother had been wrong about that wrong for so many years through so much lonesomeness. And she thought that her mother had been wrong about the wrong thing. It wasn't the skillet that had ended the lonesomeness. It was what she'd done with it. She'd carried that skillet into a valley full of hungry, frightened, lonely people, and she'd fed them. And in feeding them, she'd built the one thing she'd never had and never dared hope for. A home. A place where she was known. A place where she belonged, not because a man had married her into it, but because she'd earned it with her own 2 hands, loaf by loaf, day by day, until a whole valley couldn't imagine itself without her. And now the man across the table wasn't offering to give her a home. She already had one. She'd built it herself. He was offering to share the one they'd built together. That was different. That was everything. Jacob Hayes, she said. And her voice was steady, and her eyes were wet, and she was not ashamed of either. When I first came up that road, you looked at me the way every man's looked at me my whole life. My body first. And you were fixing to send me off before I'd said 10 words. She held up a hand as he started to speak. No, let me finish. I need to say this. Because it matters. That first day you looked at my body, and you saw a joke same as everybody. But by supper time, you'd looked at my face. And in a year, Jacob, you never once looked at my body again, the way you did that first day. Not once. You're the only man I ever met who saw the woman standing inside this body and forgot to care about the size of it. Her voice broke, and she let it. Do you know what that is to a woman like me? Do you know what it is to be seen? I spent 15 years invisible. 15 years being nothing but a size to everybody I met. And then I walked into your kitchen, and somewhere in these 3 seasons, you looked at me so long and so true that I stopped being a size and started being a person, even to myself. She reached across the table and took his rough, scarred hands in her own. So yes, Abigail Harper said. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I need you. You're right about that, I don't. I'll marry you because a year ago I stopped running, and you're the reason I stopped. And I've spent every day since finding out that the place I earned through honest work is the same place my heart wants to stay. I built a home in this kitchen with my own 2 hands, and there is no soul on this earth I'd rather share it with than the one man who looked at all of me and called it beautiful. She smiled, and the tears ran, and she didn't care. Yes, Jacob. This time with no crisis and no gossip and no courtroom with nobody watching and nothing to prove, just you and me at our own table where everything true between us has always happened. Yes, I choose you. And Jacob Hayes came around that table and he took Abigail Harper's face in his 2 rough hands. The face he'd learned to see that first supper time and never looked away from since. And he kissed her gentle. The way you kiss the one thing in the world you're sure of. They were married in the late spring in the Hayes Ranch yard under a sky washed blue and clean, and the whole valley came. They came in wagons and on horseback and on foot down every road and creek path in the county, the Coplands and the Hendersons, and 50 other families. Old Hendricks down from Bozeman, looking 10 years younger. Sheriff Dunbar, standing straight in a clean shirt, even Commissioner Ellsworth, who cried though he'd deny it after. Delia Reyes stood up beside Abigail as her witness, thin and beaming, her 4 children scrubbed and combed, and little Toby the boy Abigail had fed in the mud a year before carried the ring on a pillow and was so proud of it he could hardly walk straight. Cole wept openly and wasn't ashamed. Pete gave the bride away gray and gruff and honored past speaking. And Dutch, hard-bitten Dutch, carved the couple a wooden sign for over the kitchen door, and it said, "Only Harper Hayes Kitchen, all welcome." And when Abigail saw it, she had to sit down for the crying. They were not married because a lonely cowboy had finally found himself a wife. The whole valley knew better than that now. They were married because a woman the world had thrown away had walked into a broken place with nothing but a skillet and a cookbook, and a stubborn refusal to be less than she was, and she had fed it and healed it and taught it to stand together, and in doing all that, she had become the beating heart of the entire valley, and the man who loved her was only the last and the luckiest of the many she had saved. The story of Abigail Harper did not end with the wedding. It went on for years, for decades, the way the best stories do, quiet and steady and good. The Harper Hayes Kitchen never once in all the years that followed turned away a hungry soul. Travelers learned to look for its light. Widows and orphans and broken men found their way to that door and found a hot meal and a kind word, and more often than not, honest work and a reason to stay. Abigail taught a generation of valley girls to cook and a generation of valley children their letters, and she kept the ranch's books so straight that Hayes Ranch became the most prosperous outfit in 3 counties, and she never once to her dying day let anyone go hungry within a day's ride of her stove. Cole grew up and married a schoolteacher and named his first daughter Abigail. Delia Reyes's children grew up strong and fed, and never forgot the woman who'd walked 2 miles down a dark creek to save the littlest one's life. Toby the boy from the mud grew up to be a doctor, the first the valley ever raised, and he always said it started with a piece of bread pressed into a starving child's hand by a woman everyone else had laughed at. And Abigail and Jacob grew old together in the house they'd healed at the table, where everything true between them had always happened, and their love was never the kind that gets sung about in ballads, all fire and grand gestures. It was better than that. It was the kind that shows up every single morning, that keeps the coffee hot and the accounts straight and the door open to whoever's hungry. The kind built not on need, but on the daily choice of 2 people who'd looked at each other true and decided over and over for the rest of their lives to stay. Years later, when Abigail Harper Hayes was an old woman with silver hair and a kitchen that had fed half the valley, a young girl passing through, thin and frightened and mocked for her size, the way Abigail had once been mocked, came to that door looking for work and expecting to be turned away. And Abigail Harper, old now but still large, still herself took the girl by the hand and sat her down at the long wooden table and fed her and looked at her the way Jacob had once looked at Abigail, past the body to the person standing inside it. "Sit down, honey," Abigail said. "You eat. And then you and me are going to talk about the work, because a body who can work honest never needs to beg for anything in this world. And don't you let anybody tell you different." She patted the girl's hand. "They'll look at your body first. Folks always do. But you let them look, and you do your work, and you feed the hungry ones, and you stand up when it's time to stand, and you never ever let a soul on this earth tell you what you're worth. Because your worth isn't theirs to give, child. It never was. It's yours. It was always yours. And once you know that deep down where it counts, there is not one thing in this whole wide world that can ever take it from you again." The girl looked up at the old woman with wet eyes, and something in her that had been bent a long time began slowly to straighten. And Abigail Harper Hayes smiled and cut the girl another slice of pie. Because some truths are too big for words, and the only way she'd ever known to say them was to feed a hungry soul until she understood all the way down that she was worth feeding. That was the whole of it. That was all she'd ever done. And it had been more than enough to change a valley, mend a broken man, and turn a woman the world threw away into the most beloved soul in 3 counties. She had asked for nothing but honest work. She had earned a home, a love, and a legacy that outlived her by generations. And to the end of her long good life, Abigail Harper Hayes remained exactly what she had told a yard full of laughing men. She was on a summer day a lifetime before, when she'd stood alone in the mud, with nothing to her name but the truth of who she was. Not a bride, not a joke, not a size, just a cook. The finest that Valley ever knew, and the strongest and the kindest and the most beloved. And that in the end turned out to be the greatest thing a person could ever be.